Good morning. Are you all sitting comfortably? Have you all had a good night, having enjoyed the first day of this conference in honour and memory of Frances Yates? I'm sure the second day will be just as exciting and just as interesting, especially because we're starting this morning with Dr. Hungary, who, of course, is well known as being Professor of History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents in Amsterdam University, in fact, a founding professor of that department, as well as having written books of which most have in their title the word esoteric. So, obviously, the right kind of person to be speaking this morning. And he also has not been afraid of questioning Frances Yates' views of Hermeticism. And I'm sure Frances Yates would have been very happy to have started this debate, as it were, which Wouter is very much involved in. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Wouter, and he will be talking today about Frances Yates and ancient Egypt.
Okay, good morning. Hope you can hear me well like this. Yeah. In the second chapter of Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition, Frances Yates gave a summary of 4 selected treatises from the Corpus Hermeticum and the Latinus Crepius. She introduced her analysis with the following passage, to which I would like to call your special attention. Here we go. The reader whose interests may be aroused in the true nature of these works, as documents for pagan Gnosticism in the early centuries Anno Domini, may be referred to Festugière's massive volumes on La Révélation der Mysticisme, in which he treats exhaustively of the philosophical sources and brilliantly reconstructs the social and religious atmosphere of this period. For our purposes here, the critical and historical problems of the Hermetic literature are irrelevant, for they would have been entirely unknown to Ficino and his readers. And we are going to try to approach these documents imaginatively, as Ficino and the whole Renaissance after him approached them, as revelations of most ancient Egyptian wisdom, by a writer who lived long before Plato and even longer before Christ. To keep up this illusion, I shall give the 5 treatises here analyzed Egyptian titles, and I shall refer throughout to their author as Hermes Trismegistus. For it seems to me that it is only by entering with some degree of sympathy into the huge illusion of their vast antiquity and Egyptian character that one can hope to realize the tremendous impact which these works made on the Renaissance reader. Now, in this passage, I would like to highlight a few passages that strike me as particularly important. The approach that Frances Yates was actually advocating here has been discussed in more recent years by the great German Egyptologist Jan Assmann under the label Memo-history, in German Gedächtnisgeschichte, the history of collective memory, or if one will, the history of the historical imagination. In other words, Yates was interested in how Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, Giordano Bruno and other Renaissance thinkers had been imagining ancient Egypt in their mind, much more than in the question of whether those imaginative memories of Egypt were factually correct or not. That is to say, whether they matched the true historical realities of the Hermetic literature and their original context. More than that, she clearly took it for granted that they did not. The vast antiquity and Egyptian character of the Hermetic literature she considered to be just a huge illusion. Now, what Yates did not realize was that in making those statements, she was herself dependent not so much on an objective and dispassionate historical assessment of Hermetism in late antiquity, but on yet another huge and actually very passionate mnemo-historical construct, that of the great French scholar Father André-Jean Festugière, whom she quotes profusively throughout this chapter and indeed throughout her book. For this, I hasten to add, she was absolutely not to blame. Together with Arthur Darby Nock, Festugière had edited What still remains the standard critical edition and French translation of the Hermetic literature. And at the time when Yates was writing his La Révélation des Mysticistes, 1942 to 54, in 4 massive volumes, was the standard scholarly reference that completely dominated academic perspectives on the Hermetica, and would continue to do so for a long time. Yates was therefore referring to the best and most advanced scholarship available in her time. Nevertheless, it must be said that Festugière's work looks very different from the perspective of contemporary scholarship on the Hermetica, and this has important implications for how we assess Frances Yates' contributions today. In the years just before and after Yates' death, Jean-Pierre Mahe published a revolutionary monograph in 2 volumes, Hermes en Haute Egypte, a masterpiece of philological depth and precision that completely overturned Festugière's interpretations in many crucial respects. It was followed in 1986 by Garth Fowland's equally important volume, The Egyptian Hermes, which looked at the Hermetica from a perspective of social history, with a strong emphasis on religious practice. Mahe and Fowland disagreed on various points, but they agreed entirely in rejecting most of Festugière's basic assumptions. In this lecture today, I basically want to argue that in order to understand Frances Yates' famous grand narrative of the Hermetic tradition, it must be understood in the context of this important paradigm shift that was happening in the scholarly study of the Hermetica around the time that she was herself achieving fame. In this shift, Yates represented the past, not the future, and therefore we will need to reassess her work from the perspective of current research on the Hermetica. Now, as a background to that argument, I first need to give you a brief summary of the conclusions that I've drawn in my previous work about Frances Yates' grand narrative of the Hermetic tradition. Because my chair at the University of Amsterdam is titled History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents, you will understand that her publications have necessarily been an important point of reference for me, and my 1999 inauguration speech, The End of the Hermetic Tradition, written at the time when I was still young and handsome, was in fact a critique of Frances Yates. What I meant was not the end of the Hermetic tradition, as some people thought, but I meant the end of Frances Yates' narrative of the Hermetic tradition. Now, criticizing a scholar like Frances Yates does not mean, of course, dismissing or disparaging her. On the contrary, it means recognizing and honoring her great importance as a key figure whose ideas are worthy of the most serious attention. I think we must concede that Yates' most central assertions have been overturned by the progress of scholarship over more than half a century, and although her grand narrative of the Hermetic tradition still dominates popular perceptions among non-specialists even today, in fact, her narrative has not stood the test of time from a scholarly perspective. And without that grand narrative, however, and I completely agree with what Brian said about this yesterday, without that grand narrative, there would have been nothing for us to respond to or improve on in the first place. And the fact is that we owe a very large debt to Frances Yates for her courage and creativity in confidently leading the way towards recovering an enormous new domain of research that was still in a state of bad neglect during the 1960s, but it has been developing with great speed since her groundbreaking work. In short, all the points of rather severe critique that I'm about to formulate should be understood within the broader context of my enormous respect and admiration for Frances Yates and her historical achievements. What then are the most problematic aspects of Frances Yates' Hermetic tradition? I can only discuss them briefly here while referring you to my previous work for the detailed argument. The first point is very simple. And if one looks more closely at Yates' central protagonists, then one must conclude, I think, that they cannot, in fact, be considered Hermeticists or Hermetic philosophers. Ficino was a Christian Platonist for whom the Persian Zoroaster, and not the Egyptian Hermes, was the original fount of wisdom. The newly discovered Corpus Hermeticum that he had to translate on orders of Cosimo de' Medici appears to have disappointed him, and probably it disappointed Cosimo as well. It had, in any case, little impact on Ficino's later work. The famous first Latin edition of the Corpus Hermeticum, translated by Ficino, known as the Pimanda, published in Treviso in 1471, was in fact an unauthorized and heavily corrupt version full of misprints and botched sentences, to the point of unreadability. It was rushed through the press by the Flemish humanist Gerard van der Leyden and his Italian colleague Francesco Rondello, who did not bother to check the proofs. And that is very noticeable. Most of the later editions were dependent on this defective first edition, leading to countless attempts at improving the text that in fact caused all kinds of new misreadings. So the result is that prior to the publication of the Greek original by Adrien Turneb in 1554, it was very hard for any Renaissance reader to find out what exactly Hermes had been trying to say. As for Pico della Mirandola and Bruno, for them too, the Hermetica by no means dominated their thinking, in spite of the impression that one might get from Frances Yates' account. By contrast with these famous thinkers, there was in fact one real Christian Hermetist, active during the last decades of the 15th century, and he had been highlighted, in fact, as centrally important to the revival of Hermetism by Cristeller, Garin, and other Italian scholars since the 1930s. However, this figure, a minor humanist named Lodovico Lazzarelli, was marginalized by Frances Yates in her narrative simply because he did not at all fit her idea of what the Hermetic tradition should be all about. Lazzarelli had almost no interest in astral magic or in natural magic. He could not be seen as a Hermetic herald of scientific progress, and he was an extremely minor figure in any case. The other candidate for an actual Hermetic philosopher in the Renaissance was Cornelius Agrippa, whose central doctrines are heavily dependent on the same Lazzarelli, but who did not fit Yates' narrative either. For her, Agrippa represented what she thought of as that old dirty magic, that's a quotation, of the medieval grimoires, not the elegant new Hermetic perspective that she attributed to Ficino and Pico. In short, Cristeller and his successors had firmly placed Lazzarelli on the stage as central to the revival of Hermetism in the Renaissance, but Frances Yates pushed him off the stage again, in order to put a spotlight on some famous thinkers for whom the Hermetica were in fact rather marginal. That's the first point. The second point concerns Frances Yates' understanding of the Hermetic tradition as imbued with astral magic. Now the fact is that although she attributed the Renaissance revival of astral magic to the decisive impulse of the newly discovered Corpus Hermeticum, that collection actually focuses on, as Brian Kopenhaver said it already, and I completely agree, that collection actually focuses on spiritual salvation of the soul and contains no significant discussions of astral magic. The references that Yates was using came not from the Corpus, but from the Latin Asclepius, a text that had been known and discussed throughout the Middle Ages, and therefore did not bring anything new in Ficino's time. It is very instructive in this regard to simply count Yates' text and footnote references in Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition. Our second chapter discusses Corpus Hermeticum 1 and 10 to 13 plus the Asclepius, as I've already indicated. Now for the rest, Corpus Hermeticum 1, the Parmenides, is quoted around 24 times, most of them in chapter 3, and 3 times in footnotes. Corpus Hermeticum 2 to 14 and 16 to 18 are quoted rarely or not at all. For comparison, the Picatrix is quoted 23 times with 17 footnote references. But then look at the Asclepius. It is quoted no less than 80 times with 29 footnote references. And moreover, of those 18 text references, at least 45 are all to the notorious God-making passages about Hermetic idolatry, Asclepius 23, 24, and 37, 38. And this number will expand considerably if one adds Yates' multiple references to God-making, idolatry, or bad magic. In short, Frances Yates was obsessed with these few famous but relatively short passages that had evoked the wrath of theologians from Augustine to William of Auvergne and his successors. But important as they might be, these passages had been known and discussed by medieval thinkers, at least since William of Auvergne, and were unrelated to the contents of the Corpus Hermeticum that, according to Yates, had kick-started the Renaissance revival of austral magic. I've argued elsewhere that it's misleading to speak of an Hermetic tradition in the Renaissance. At most, we are dealing with a very confused Renaissance discourse about Hermes Trismegistus and what he was supposed to have said. A much better way of conceptualizing the situation, and this is my third point, is in terms of John Walbridge's concept of Platonic Orientalism. Now, if we can manage to forget Edward Said for a moment, I know it's difficult, but let's try. Then Platonic Orientalism here means the extremely widespread idea, revived in the Renaissance period, that Platonism was primarily a rational, Platonic Orientalism means that Platonism was not primarily a rational philosophical tradition, but a religious or spiritual one, concerned with the salvation of the soul. And secondly, that Plato had not been the originator of that tradition, but just a heir and transmitter, and of a tradition that had really come not from the Greeks, but from barbarian sources. Ficino, like Themistocles Platon before him, was defending not an Hermetic, but a Zoroastrian variant of Platonic Orientalism. Pico, for his part, was defending a Mosaic variant, leading everything back to a secret revelation of Kabbalistic wisdom at Mount Sinai. This, for him, was the origin of the Kabbalah, which he believed to be Christian in essence, simply because otherwise it could not be true. Bizarre as it might seem, given how much we have become accustomed to the Yatesian narrative, precisely a Hermetic variant of Platonic Orientalism is not so easy to find. Even Lazzaretti does not qualify, because for him it is all about Hermes and Christ plus some Kabbalah, and Plato or later Platonic thinkers play almost no role at all in his narrative. Perhaps the best candidate for an Hermetic variant of Platonic Orientalism is precisely Frances Yates' Bête Noire, again, Cornelius Agrippa. Now, if there is any truth to these arguments at all, and I believe that they are compelling, then very little is left of Frances Yates' inspiring and exciting narrative of a grand Hermetic tradition full of austral magic that had supposedly erupted into public awareness after 1471 from the sensation of the Corpus Hermeticum, a tradition that had supposedly been represented by great luminaries such as Ficino, Pico, and Bruno, and it had opened the way towards science and progress. So I think that there are no good foundations for any of those assumptions. True, there was a Renaissance discourse about Hermes and the Hermetica that deserves our serious interest, and obviously the same is true for astral magic. But unfortunately, these discourses are much more complex and far less heroic than one would gather from the wonderful story told in Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition. The real Hermetic tradition was a very discreet affair, emanating from an intellectually profound and fascinating, but marginal and isolated figure, Lodovico Lazzaretti, whose works remained unpublished until 1505, and whose ideas lived on incognito in just a few later thinkers, notably Cornelius Agrippa. So much then for Frances Yates' grand narrative of the Hermetic tradition. Now, her enthusiastic search for the origins of the Hermetic writings did, of course, lead her to travel back in her mind, or in her historical imagination, to the Hellenized Egypt of the Roman Empire. Her travel guides there was a French Dominican friar and great classicist, already mentioned, André-Jean Festugière. Here you have him then. Festugière's authority was great and very well deserved, as we have seen, but from the vantage point of the present, we can see how his ideological commitments pushed Yates in a direction that is hard to reconcile with current scholarship on the Hermetica, and therefore needs to be revised. Now, the assumptions about the Hermetica that Yates adopted from Festugière have much to do with the strong tradition of Philhellenism in classical studies. For those among you who may be less familiar with that term, Philhellenism was grounded in dominant 19th century traditions of liberal individualism and neo-humanism, an optimistic intellectual culture that strongly emphasized rationality and the emancipatory power of classical Bildung. Philhellenism took different forms in different countries. In the German-speaking world, it tended to be understood in terms of a specific kind of cultural Protestantism, Kulturprotestantismus, but in countries like France or Belgium, it could also be embedded in an intellectual culture on Roman Catholic foundations. In any case, its typical representatives in academia were convinced about the historical uniqueness and superiority of Judeo-Christian religion on the one hand, and Greek rationalism on the other. From a Philhellenist perspective, Greek philosophy and Christian religion had joined forces in late antiquity to create the foundations of a superior Western culture, and this combination was imagined as a crucial bulwark of reason and morality against the threatening forces of unreason and immorality, represented by the Orient, notably Egypt, with its magical superstitions and its idolatrous cults. Now, in the decades around 1900, this dominant perspective was increasingly challenged by a new generation of broadly neo-romantic scholars who had begun to doubt the progressivist optimism of the Philhellenist school. Central representatives were Albrecht Dieterich and Richard Reitzenstein. They were clearly influenced by or representative of the fin de siècle zeitgeist, notably its obsession with processes of decadence and decline. As formulated by Suzanne Marchand, they were particularly interested in three dimensions that were more or less taboo in standard Philhellenist scholarship: the impact of the Orient on Western ideas, the erotic life of the ancients, and the role of religion in pagan antiquity. The common denominator was obvious. This triad of sex, religion, and the Orient stood for the irrational, and obviously it challenged the rationalist bias of established Philhellenic scholarship. This does not mean that these scholars were advanced in non-rational methodologies. Quite to the contrary, their extremely erudite scholarship was grounded in expert philological research and deep textual criticism of primary sources, quoted usually in the original languages without bothering about translations. But different from the Philhellenists, they strongly advocated interdisciplinary and comparative research, approaches for which their Philhellenist opponents had nothing but contempt. A remark by the famous Pope of Philhellenism, Ulrich Wilamowitz Müllendorf, captures this attitude very well. About other peoples, I have no opinion. I know the Greeks. Modern scholarship of the Hermetica got kickstarted in 1904 by one of the leaders of the Neo-Romantic school, Richard Reitzenstein, with his fundamental study Poimandries, Studien zur griechisch-ägyptischen und frühchristlichen Literatur, studies of Greek, Egyptian, and early Christian literature. The very subtitle was meant as a provocation, and it was understood as such. It says that the Hermetica were not just Greek, but Egyptian too. And they were not just philosophical, they were religious. And moreover, the purely pagan religion in question was considered relevant somehow for understanding early Christianity. All of this was taken as a provocation by classicists in the Philhellenic school. The Hermetic writings were written in Greek, and full of philosophical terminology, of course, but Reitzenstein suggested that their real content had to do at least as much, if not more, with the non-rational mysticism of the Orient. Reitzenstein's book was the beginning of an academic turf war between neo-romantic comparativists, sympathetic to religion and the Orient, and Philhellenic classicists, who felt that they had to defend the primacy of reason and the Greeks against Egypt and its dark superstitions. Both parties wanted to claim Hermes for themselves. Joseph Cole's large study, Die Lehren des Hermes Trismegistus of 1913, was designed to refute Reitzenstein and to demonstrate that nothing in the Hermetica was really Oriental or Egyptian, because it all came down to popularized forms of Greek philosophy. This earned him an extremely lengthy and quite famous rebuttal by Reitzenstein's ally, Willem Bousset, who introduced an element into the debate that would prove to have fateful and, in my opinion, basically negative consequences for the future study of the Hermetica. Bousset claimed that in order to resolve the apparent contradictions in the Hermetic literature, one needed to distinguish between optimistic, monistic treatises on one hand and pessimistic dualist ones on the other. This latter type got associated almost universally at that time with the theologically loaded concept of Gnosticism. Now, another 10 years later, in 1924, Walter Scott published the first of what would become a 4-volume edition and translation of all the Hermetica in English. Scott's work was grounded in an extreme form of Greek philosophical rationalism that sought to systematically improve or correct the Greek originals themselves by marginalizing, suppressing, or rephrasing anything that struck him as, in his own words, occult rubbish. It is obvious that Scott was trying to secure a definitive victory for classicist Philhellenism and its rationalist agendas, but in fact the attempt blew up in his face. In a long series of extraordinarily critical book reviews, it's a bloodbath if you read it. Scott's extreme editorial procedures were universally condemned by all the major specialists in the field, and his edition is now generally considered a failure. As noted by one specialist, by formally excising everything that struck him as occult rubbish, Scott ended up transforming an obscure religious document into a clear philosophical treatise, which it had never been. Now, this quite disastrous situation when it comes to textual study of the Hermetica provides the background to Festugière's work, and therefore indirectly to that of Frances Yates. In collaboration with Arthur Darby Nock, Festugière produced the first solid and reliable edition in French translation of the Hermetica. Published in 4 volumes between 1946 and 1954, it remains the standard reference. Moreover, he himself published his fundamental monograph, La Révélation des Trismegistes, there it is again, in 4 volumes from 1942 to 54. Now, who was Festugière? And what was it that led this devout Dominican priest to devote the largest part of his professional life to study of pagan spirituality? Here we are dealing with the most important influence on Frances Yates when it comes to what the Hermetica were all about. Who was this man? Even the director of the famous Budé collection, Paul Masson, seems to have been surprised about his interest in pagan spirituality. When Festugière brought him his manuscripts about Hermes, Masson seems to have exclaimed, "Festugière, I love you, but I don't love that Hermes of yours." La Révélation des Trismegistes ends with a sentence that could well be applied to Festugière himself. Very final sentence goes, "The historian knows only what he is being told. He does not penetrate the secret of the heart." Now, Festugière too did not like to speak about himself, but we know just enough to make some guesses about the secrets of his fascination with Hermes Trismegistus. He had warm memories of his mother, whose portrait on his desk was always surrounded by flowers, but his father inspired fear and reserve. His upbringing is described as severe. When he was 18 years old, he lost one of his brothers in the war, and later he would describe him as his angelic intercessor in heaven. Another brother died of tuberculosis a few years later. In 1923, 25 years old, Festugière seems to have experienced an existential crisis that was resolved by a profound religious experience. "I was searching, but I did not find. The response came like a lightning flash. In a few minutes, I decided to offer myself to God. The reason is simple. I felt loved." For the rest of his life, Festugière would be obsessed by the question of the origin of evil, while looking for confirmation of God's love. Although he had many friends, his inner life seems to have been marked by loneliness and even despair, as can be gathered from a rare confession. There are hours of presence and there are hours of absence, and it can happen that the absence continues for months, for years, and then the servant of God, who has given everything, is truly alone, completely alone, and there are no words for his suffering. Festugière's friends knew him as a nervous small man who hardly ever left his cell, where he kept his books, and who could get very impatient with anybody who interfered with his studies. It tends to be forgotten, but is obviously relevant in view of his influence on Frances Yates, that Festugière's earliest studies were devoted not to late antiquity, but to the Renaissance, and more specifically to Marsilio Ficino's Platonic philosophy of love. Given Festugière's own highly personal search for confirmation of God's love, his early focus on Ficino's De Amore seems to provide us with an important clue. For, as explained by one of his closest pupils, the intuition that governed his entire life was that of the continuation of the classical Greek tradition in the Christian Church, and the transmission of the religious idea of the Greeks, enlivened by the gospel, to the society of the Roman Empire. So here we have a clear instance of the basic Philhellenist belief in a deep kinship between the philosophical culture of Greek antiquity and the religion of Christianity. However, in Festugière's case, Philhellenism is combined with a perspective closer to Ficino and the basic Platonic Orientalist perspectives prior to Schleiermacher. That is to say, the non-rationalist sense of a deep spiritual kinship between the religious ideal of the Greeks and that of early Christianity. Now please note the irony of this situation, given Festugière's influence on Frances Yates. Whereas his basic motivations were religious, her primary focus was on science and progress. The first volume of Festugière's Révélations is devoted to the Hermetic literature concerned with astrology and the occult sciences. It remains a standard reference today, and it has stood the test of time much better than the remaining 3 volumes. It must have impressed Frances Yates considerably, and provided her with much information that she could use for her famous interpretation of astrology and the occult sciences as crucial impulses for the scientific revolution. This famous so-called Yates thesis would have been quite alien to Festugière, who was much more interested in Ficino's spiritual Platonism than in topics such as astral magic, a focus that, in fact, made his perspective more congenial to the real Hermetic tradition of thinkers like Lazzarelli than to the pseudo-Hermeticism, as I have to say, invented by Yates. Be that as it may, Festugière's second volume, by far the largest of the 4, was called De Dieu Cosmique, and it focused on the world-affirming and largely panentheist worldviews of late antiquity. He referred to them as La Religion du Monde, the direct origin, of course, of Frances Yates' frequent references to Hermeticism as the religion of the world. Now, the strange thing is that only the first 70 pages of this massive monograph were devoted to the Hermetic writings, followed by more than 500 pages devoted to Xenophon, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoa, Cicero, and Philo of Alexandria. It is here that something was going badly wrong in Festugière's work. I already stated that Yates had pushed the real Hermetists off the stage to replace them with Platonists, while still calling them Hermetists. Festugière had been doing something very similar. His Hermetic religion of the world was dominated by non-Hermetic authors. For readers like Yates, it now became very easy to present any cosmic or world-affirming religion of the world as a form of Hermeticism. Here, I think, we find the origin of the enormous expansion of the term Hermeticism that would evoke the deep irritation of no one less than Eugenio Garin, one of Yates' chief mentors, who nevertheless complained that in her later work, I quote, "The notion of Hermetic tradition tends to be broadened enormously to the extent of becoming all-encompassing and elusive." In addition to this point, another one must be noted. Festugière was really saying that everything found in the Hermetica could easily be found in other Greek traditions of late antiquity too. There was really nothing original or specific or even remarkable about them. The Hermetica contained nothing but simplified and popularized versions of the standard popular cosmic religion of the empire. That's the basic message of his second volume. Most importantly, there was nothing specifically Egyptian about them either. When Frances Yates called the ancient Egyptian character of the Hermetica a vast illusion, she was simply repeating Festugière. Festugière's final 2 volumes were the most problematic ones. One feels that as he got older, the enormity of the project began to overwhelm and exhaust him. And unfortunately, he was falling victim to the demands of the monist optimist versus dualist pessimist straitjacket that had become an almost unavoidable dogma in Hermetic studies after Bossuet. Volume 3 was about the doctrine of the soul and its fall into matter, and Volume 4 was about the goal of liberation from this world, through a mystical gnosis that would enable the soul to find its way back to le Dieu inconnu, the purely spiritual, alien God beyond this material reality of ours, beyond this world in which Festugière himself was suffering from loneliness and doubt in his lowly self, studying his books. While working one's way forward through these large and extremely erudite tomes, it becomes ever more impossible to overlook the impact of Festugière's own anguished search for truth, his deeply ambiguous intuition that something resembling the search for the true Christian God must be found in pagan sources as well. However, those sources at least had to be Greek, not Egyptian. His Philhellenist convictions dictated that while the Greeks and the Christians could and should somehow be reconciled on some deep spiritual level, no such reconciliation could ever be possible with the Orient, least of all with Egypt, the heart of darkness, the source of magic and superstition. Tragic as it may be, Festugière's lifelong attempt to exorcise Egypt from the religion of Hermes Trismegistus was bound to fail. When new Hermetic manuscripts in Coptic were discovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, he responded with enormous irritation and condescension, dismissing the very idea that our understanding of the Hermetica could possibly be threatened by une jar d'Égypte, a jar from Egypt. This is a famous quotation, the une jar d'Égypte. It has been repeated endlessly. Nevertheless, of course, that is exactly what happened. Careful study of the Coptic Hermetica, and especially the treatise of the Octavite and the Ennead, would finally undermine the Philhellenist perspective completely. In the wake of Jean-Pierre Mahé's editions from 1978 and 82, the Hermetic turf war that had begun in 1904 has now definitely, I think, been decided in favor of Egypt. In sum, Frances Yates' Hermetic Egypt was really the Egypt of Festugière's imagination. A highly influential mixture of Philhellenist anti-Oriental and anti-Egyptian bias on the one hand, and his personal and very intimate quest for Christian salvation on the other. On these foundations, Frances Yates nevertheless built a highly influential new narrative of the Hermetic tradition that gave a science-oriented and progressivist spin to Festugière's religion of the world, regardless of Festugière's own belief that the revelation of Hermes Trismegistus was ultimately not about this worldly science at all, but about an otherworldly encounter with the alien god through mystical gnosis. The ironies of intellectual history and reception history are deep and instructive, as we all know. Frances Yates followed Festugière in believing that the great antiquity and Egyptian character of the Hermetica were a vast illusion. But on the contrary, the true illusion consists in Festugière's perception of the Hermetica as non-Egyptian. And from current research, it is becoming clear that while the Hermetica are certainly products of Roman Egypt, their Egyptian elements must in fact be seen against the background of traditions that ultimately go much further back in time than used to be assumed in the wake of Casaubon. As for Frances Yates, her basic understanding of the Hermetic tradition, admirable and impressive as it may be for the general reader, has proved to be a huge illusion as well. In this respect, ironically enough, Festugière's early work about Ficino's religion of love may have been somewhat closer to the truth of what Platonic Orientalism in the Renaissance was all about, and how it related to the true Hermetic tradition of Lazzarelli. In short, nothing is what it once seemed to be. And to quote Brian Copenhaver, in the study of the Hermetica too, all has changed utterly. On the deepest level of analysis, what needs to be considered and reconsidered is the legacy of Philhellenist bias against the Orient in general and against Egypt in particular. And this legacy must be placed in a larger context of 2 centuries of controversies around the relation between Christian theology and Greek philosophy on the one hand, and Hellenistic paganism on the other. Many of Frances Yates' answers have not stood the test of time. But asking the right questions is often more important than finding the right answers as well. It might be a bit asking too much to ask of anybody to ask the right questions and also find the right answers. Yates' questions were a reflection of deep intuitions from which we are still profiting, even though we have moved far beyond that today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Wouter. I'm sure what you have said will raise a lot of questions and discussion amongst us. We will wait for the discussion until after the next talk, just before the coffee break. partly, I think, because the next talk will somehow mesh into what Wouter has already said. It is by Georgi Sonyi, who's professor of history in the University of Szeged in Hungary, and has been very much associated with Frances Yates. If I can just insert a small personal reference here. When I arrived first as a research fellow at the Warburg Institute in 1979, I was privileged to be a participant, in fact a contributor, to Frances Yates' last seminar at the Institute, which, believe it or not, was on the Hermetic tradition. And I believe that Yogi has also the privilege of being the host for Frances Yates' last trip to Europe. Yes. Yes. So over to you.
Thank you very much. Just a second. I don't think I can live up in any way to Wouter's fascinating lecture. And when my talk consists of two parts, somewhat connected but not entirely. The first part is partly autobiographical about myself and of that famous week when Frances Yates came to Hungary a couple of weeks before her death. In the second part, I would like to talk about her influence on Hungarian scholarship, but in both cases, please bear in mind that my perspective is really a kind of reconstruction of the late 1970s, 1980s, early 1990s, so obviously I'm not going to refer those reconsiderations and new perspectives which have happened since then and which Wouter so admirably demonstrated a minute ago. It is not very common that a scholar in the humanities acquires such fame and esteem that a biography is published about his or her intellectual career. Frances Yates has achieved this 27 years after her death. In 2008, Marjorie Jones published Frances Yates and the Hermetic Tradition. I cannot fully evaluate the merits of this monograph, but I was glad to see that some information is included about Yates's last months, which brought her to Hungary. It is also clear that up to the day when she fell on her doorsteps, she was engaged in trying to promote an English publication about the Hungarian Renaissance. The monograph cites a few entries from Dame Frances's diary and mentions a few Hungarian names, although misspelled, including mine. However, the Hungarian sojourn still needs much to be revealed. The first seed which brought fruit in her visit in 1981 can be traced back to July 1973, when I was a second-year student of English and Hungarian literature at the University of Szeged, and decided to write a letter to Frances Yates, asking her advice how to order her books in Hungary, since our libraries only had a few of her works, and borrowing as well as ordering was complicated, roundabout, and expensive. So that was the letter of a second-year BA student to her. I also touched upon some ideological, political circumstances of Hungarian scholarship, mentioning that my aim was to prove that the Middle Ages provided a valuable context to the Renaissance, contra official Marxist scholarship, that cared only to talk about enlightened classical Renaissance. Why did I write this letter? 2 months earlier, I was sent by my department to the annual conference of the Renaissance Research Center of the Hungarian Academy, and my supervisor introduced me to Professor Tibor Klonicai, director of the center, promoting me as somebody who was interested in the dark side of the Renaissance. At the meeting, Professor Klonicai handed me a copy of Dame Frances's Bruno book. I read it with great speed and got under its spell, maybe up to today, maybe up to Wouter's lecture a minute ago. To my delightful surprise, in late August, I received a small packet. In it, a paperback copy of the Bruno book and a few offprints by its author, as well as a kind letter in which she wrote, I'm very interested to hear of your work and your interests, then directed me to her publishing house Routledge, not knowing that in communist Hungary a student could not obtain hard currency to order books from the West, and suggested me to read the Rosicrucian Enlightenment as well, published not much earlier, in which, as she mentioned, I argue that it was precisely the Hermetic elements in the Renaissance which led to the Enlightenment. By 1977, I read most of her books and I could get hold of, and also exchanged a few letters with her, and published a review in Hungarian about her Bruno and Rosicrucian books. Before my graduation in 1977, I received the 3-week-long British Council study trip to England, and I immediately contacted Frances Yates, who kindly received me in the Warburg Institute. Our correspondence and this visit greatly inspired me to write up my MA thesis, defended in 1977, into a scholarly pocketbook, which was published in a popular series under the title Secret Sciences and Superstitions. The title was not given by me, but by publisher, which, believe it or not, was selling in 25,000 copies at that time, legitimizing a non-dogmatically Marxist interpretation of the dark side of the Renaissance and the revisionist approach to science history. I was delighted to send a copy to her in exchange, of which I received a kind 2-page letter in October 78. That's the rather ugly title of my little book, and her answer from 78. In 1980, I went to my first international conference as a speaker to Ireland, and on the way back I stopped in London, again meeting Dame Frances. I delivered to her an unofficial invitation to Hungary, which after her consent was turned into an official exchange visit between the British and Hungarian academies, facilitated by the British Council. The mastermind behind this visit was Professor Tibor Klanicai, and here I would like to present the archival documents which show the details of the organization of her program. On the next slides you will see several texts in Hungarian, but these are the documents which we could recall. However, there are some English as well. In late February, Klanicai wrote to Yates, and that you can see up there. Thank you very much for your letter of 19th of February, from which I'm glad to learn that the first half of June will be convenient for your visit, and we are so much looking forward to. Furthermore, we would very much like if you could stay at least a week here, and if beside the lecture to be held at the British Council, organized by the British Council, you could give another talk at the Center for Renaissance Research. And lastly, it is needless to say, he wrote, we shall strive to show you the monuments of Budapest which can be of interest to you, as well as some places outside Budapest that are connected with the Renaissance. The next step was that Yates had to fill in a form designed for the Anglo-Hungarian Cultural Exchange Program. Some of the questions were clearly invented by Hungarian party officials. Dame Frances, with some mild sarcasm, filled those in. When asked about her marital status, she wrote spinster. For title, added dame. For occupation, just writer. And for specialist subject, historical and cultural, particularly the Renaissance period. This was signed on the 31st of March, and on the very same day, Dr. Judith Karafiat, foreign coordinator of the Institute for Literary Studies, notified Comrade Odze, responsible for international affairs in the Ministry of Culture, that the Institute was ready to work out the full program as soon as they get green light from the ministry. The central administration of the Academy was soon plugged in. On the 15th of May, Ferenc Rotler, Department Chief of the Social Sciences Division, officially notified, I think I have to change here, so these are this is the official Hungarian correspondence. So this division chief officially notified the Institute of Literary Studies that Frances Yates, English researcher, was to come within the frame of the Hungarian-British Cultural Exchange. 3 days later, Tibor Klanicai wrote a letter to a number of distinguished Hungarian scholars, notifying them about the upcoming visit, summarized the merits of Frances Yates, and invited them to the various programs. On the same day, the scholarly secretary of the Institute ordered the academic printing press the production and the invitation for the scheduled main lecture. Here you have the order letter, and that's the printed invitation which advertised Frances Yates' lecture. On the 26th of May, the same scholarly secretary wrote a letter to Comrade Bocskai, head of the Chief Division of the International Relations, suggesting that before the lecture, a small reception could be organized in honor of Professor Yates, with just a few Hungarian scholars present. Permission from the Chief Division came back 2 days later. From the 27th to the 28th of May, we have the letter of Professor Klanicai detailing the program of the Yates visit and the invitation to 8 Hungarian scholars to take part in the reception. By this time, the full program was ready, and its draft survives in Klanicai's handwriting, giving the following details. Now, this is that famous handwriting when he sketched up the visit, which contained arrival on Monday, staying at the Hotel Royal, Tuesday, sightseeing, visiting the Institute of Literary Studies, Wednesday, public lecture at the Academy, Thursday, visit to the University of Szeged, Friday, talk at the English department of ELTE University about her autobiography, Saturday, excursion to Renaissance sites outside Budapest, Sunday, free program, Monday, consultation at the Institute of Literary Studies, eventually evening concert, Tuesday, talk at the Institute on the Classical Art of Memory, and Wednesday, departure. So 9 full days. The picture shows the building of the Hungarian Academy, the big lecture hall, which was not the site of her talk, but this is the so-called picture gallery. This is where she had her last seminar. And this beautiful part is the archives of the Academy. This is where I found all this correspondence and the other documents. In 1981, I was a guest lecturer at the University of Warsaw, Poland, and I was very eager to come home for the time of Dame Frances's visit. Professor Klanicai entrusted me to escort the visitor along her program, thus help the official government-appointed interpreter. At that time, I wrote a journal myself, and recently, when preparing for this talk, I was happy to discover in it the account of the visit. I hadn't looked into it for 30 years. Let me quote a few sentences. On Monday, together with Professor Klanicai, I was at the airport waiting for her, and till Friday evening, I escorted her to all her programs. On Tuesday, she came to the Institute. On Wednesday, he had the great talk at the Academy. On Thursday, we went to Szeged by the rector's car. She gave a talk for the English and Old Hungarian Literature departments, and because, as she told, I was the first Hungarian she had met in her life. And that I taught at the University of Szeged, so that was the reason. The trip went beyond expectations, still the journal. On the way, she stopped the car because she wanted to see a stork nest on the roadside. Here we have some pictures of the University of Szeged and the stork nest, or a stork nest. The weather was boiling, plus 35 centigrade. Everybody was fainting, except the old lady, who elegantly spoke for 70 minutes in this stuffy room. On top of everything, on the way back to Budapest, she accepted the driver's offer of a non-filtered strong Hungarian cigarette, and she immediately smoked it. Then announced that in the evening she was ready to enjoy gypsy music. On Friday, she visited the Budapest English department and gave a wonderfully compassionate account about her intellectual development. In the afternoon, I escorted her to the famous Hungarian historian László Makai. At this point, with regret, I had to say goodbye to her because next day I had to fly back to Warsaw. Thus, I could not take part in the Saturday excursion, which introduced her to the Renaissance palace of Matthias Corvinus, upper pictures, in Visegrad, rebuilt in Al Antiqua style in the 1480s, and in Esztergom, lower pictures, where the Archbishop's Cathedral preserves the most beautiful Renaissance chapel outside Italy, built by Florentine masters in 1507. Nor could I escort her to the fabulous Renaissance collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Budapest, all of which she remembered in her journal. But there is one more remark in my diary which is worth quoting here. So I wrote it then, not today. She is 82 years old and perhaps the last survival of the great generation of the Warburgians, who strived for bringing intellectual and art history together. These days she hardly travels anymore, although she still appears vigorous. She decided to come to Hungary, driven by some mission commitment to build a bridge between historical research on two sides of the Iron Curtain. Yates went home very enthusiastic about Hungary. She was determined to approach Routledge with the suggestion of a collection of essays about the forgotten Hungarian Renaissance. Professor Kloniczai entrusted me to correspond about this project on behalf of the Hungarian Academy. However, on the 29th of September, Professor Trapp, director of the Warburg Institute, wrote me a letter notifying, "I'm very sorry to have to tell you that Dame Frances Yates died peacefully in her sleep early this morning." By 1983, we compiled a synopsis of a collection along the lines Frances Yates was promoting to be published in English. Director Trapp was trying to mediate towards Routledge, but finally had to write to me on the 2nd of August, 83. I have now had an answer from Dame Frances's publishers, Routledge and Kegan Paul, about the projected volume on the Hungarian Renaissance. This is, I'm sorry to say, negative. The idea of trying to show something about the Hungarian Renaissance to the English-speaking scholarly community was picked up in 1986 by Professor Giordano Bruno of Indiana University, who organized an international conference in Bloomington on this subject. And beside me, one of the participants is sitting in the audience here, George Gömöri. Also in 1987, we organized a session with this topic at the Renaissance Society of America in Phoenix, Arizona. Using the papers of these two events, I started editing a collection, which took a disappointingly long time, also hindered by the untimely deaths of Professors Ranke and Kloniczai. Finally, as late as 1995, 10 essays were published in the periodical of the International Association of Hungarian Studies under the title Lights and Shadows of the Frontier of Europe, the late Renaissance in Hungary. Oh, sorry, I missed that. So this is about the obituary, notification of Frances Yates' death, and finally the publication of these essays. As a postscript to this first part of my talk, I would like to recall how moved I became recently when I read in Marjorie Johnson's book some entries from Yates' diaries, which I could never see in the Warburg here, dating from the last month. It turns out that she was most preoccupied with her family, her long-lost brother, and apparently she had confused and gloomy thoughts, actually preparing for death. And from among those dark remarks shines through a sentence from early April, thinking about Hungary. During those days she spent with us in Hungary, nothing indicated that she would not be in full command of her strengths, mood, and intellectual capacity. She was vibrant, even thrilled by the new experiences, the hospitality, and the beauties remaining from the Renaissance on the frontiers of Western Europe. In Hungary, she apparently had no time and inclination to write into her diary. After all, she was interested in gypsy music, for example. However, there are undated remarks about some pictures she saw at the Museum of Fine Arts and the Renaissance red marble fountain of King Matthias overlooking the Danube at Visegrad. On the 10th of June, when she returned, she summed up her impressions as follows, and this is something which very much connects to Peter Burke's final remarks yesterday. So quoting Yates, "Dear people, wonderful people, we have neglected Central Europe, turned our backs on Europe, turned away to America." Now in the second part, I would like very briefly to summarize some research in Hungary already going on in the 1980s, and in many ways inspired by Frances Yates' research. The first mention of Yates in Hungarian scholarship dates from 1967 in a science historiographical review by László Vekerdi, the later editor of my Secret Sciences book. While looking through the references to Frances Yates' works by Hungarian scholars, we see that the highest number fall on the art of memory. which has been cited continuously up to today, not only by medievalists or Renaissance researchers, but from all fields of the humanities relating to the so-called popular memory studies. The silver medal goes to the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, in spite of its being severely criticized in Western scholarship. On the third place, we have the Bruno book. However, Hungarian Shakespeareans have frequently cited her Shakespeare's Last Place, and less frequently the Theatre of the World. Let me point out some areas in which the Yates' influence was particularly fertile for Hungarian scholars. First and foremost, her new non-positivistic approach and promotion of Renaissance esotericism and magic, no matter if we call it Hermetism or Hermeticism, but definitely including alchemy, astrology, and Paracelsian medicine, was very influential and opening new vistas. From the mid-70s, the previously dogmatically Marxist understanding of the Renaissance, emphasizing its democratic, progressive, and enlightened character, became replaced by a much more versatile and less essentialist view, in which the Yates thesis played the role of liberating inspiration. From this time, Hungarian scholars started collecting information about esoteric and occult books in the possession of bibliophile magnates and intellectuals in Hungary. This work was greatly boosted by a research group at the University of Szeged, systematically collecting data and reconstructing the book stock in early modern Hungarian private and institutional libraries. The results were sensational. From a Yatesian perspective, the New Horizon can be compared to the long-awaited publication of John Dee's library catalogues in 1990. Between 1980 and 2015, 53 volumes were published, mapping the whole period from the late 16th century to 1750, and all of these volumes are available online. Out of this rich material, I intend to highlight three very interesting individuals. They were such bibliophiles who were ready to dabble in the secret sciences, such as Dan Schwann, would be ready to employ a magical philosopher, for example, John Dee, such as Andras Dudic, and were ready to employ alchemists and engage in building a laboratory, such as Boldizsár Batthyány. So very briefly about these three persons. Dan Schwann was the agent of the Fuggers in Hungary from 1525 to his death, lived in Hungary, in today's Slovakia, and became a naturalized Hungarian. After studies in Vienna and Leipzig, he was employed as the manager of the Fugger-owned copper mines and copper trading company in Upper Hungary. He was interested in the natural sciences as well as in the classics, and in the expanding horizon of geography. In 1552, he took an exploratory travel in Turkey and Asia Minor, summarizing the trip in a valuable ethnographic treatise. His library consisted of 1162 published items, including 2,100 works. This was one of the largest private libraries in mid-16th century Hungary. Since the books survive in the Nationalbibliothek in Vienna, and we also have the catalogue written in Dan Schwann's own hand, scholars could analyze the contents of this collection. One interesting result is that Divinatio and Magia amounted up to 20% of the books. Andras Dudic was a Hungarian magnate, born in Buda, studied in Vienna, Brussels, and Paris. In 1560, he was elected or elevated to be Bishop of Pécs in Hungary. He had participated in the Council of Trent, while after it, he was sent to Poland as the ambassador of Emperor Maximilian II. There he left his office, converted to Protestantism, got married, and settled down in Krakow. When the Catholic Stephen Báthory became Polish king in 1575, he relocated to Silesia and lived in exile in Breslau, today's Wrocław in Poland, still an internationally acclaimed humanist and a sympathizer of the Socinian anti-Trinitarians and the Czech Brethren. His library consisted of about 4,000 volumes, including more than 5,000 prints and great many manuscripts. In this respect, it was comparable to John Dee's library, and after the fabulous collection of Johannes Sambucus, the emblem writer and later imperial librarian, probably the second largest collection possessed by a Hungarian bibliophile in the time of the Renaissance. Dudic was not only a book collector, but also a passionate letter writer. A few years ago, parallel with Stephen Plukas, I also rediscovered that the Hungarian corresponded with the Prague astronomer Tadeusz Hájek, John Dee's host in the imperial city, about his intention to consult the English doctor using his mathematical expertise. The third person I want to mention is Boldizsár Batthyány, an important Hungarian magnate who developed one of the most brilliant noble courts in the vicinity of the capital, Pozsony, today's Bratislava in Slovakia. His career started in the Habsburg court of Vienna, then in the 1560s he spent some years in Italy, Germany, the Netherlands and France, finally becoming a page to King Francis II and Mary Stuart. He seems to have made acquaintances among local Protestant families as well as refugees from the Low Countries. Among those, one can mention the printer-publisher family, the Wehels, and the famous botanist Carolus Clusius. Wehel's son-in-law, Jean Aubry, became Batthyány's bookseller for many subsequent years, and Clusius spent an important period of his career at Batthyány's Hungarian court, working on his opus on the flora of Hungary. In his court, Batthyány collected humanists, not shying away from Hermetic studies. He built an alchemical laboratory for Elias Corvinus, the alchemist laureate, where he experimented with his fellow prince practitioner, Felician von Herberstein, and others. Although Batthyány's books have been dispersed, we possess a number of receipts from his bookseller, Aubry, dating over a long period. From these, we know that the magnate had a wide spectrum of interest in which the secret sciences played a major role. He did not spare many to order a significant collection of Paracelsiana, but also owned the Corpus Hermeticum, alchemical works by Martin Ruland, Gerhard Dorn, and many others, also unidentified items like Theatrum Diabolorum and Pseudum Philosophorum. It was Robert Evans who first introduced Batthyány to the English reading public and contextualized him in the magical late Renaissance world of Rudolf II, not only in his great monograph, but also his brilliant study, the Wehel Presses. In the early 70s, Evans was clearly under the spell of Frances Yates. However, he completed her insights with meticulous archival research, an impressive knowledge of Central European languages, and thus he could exercise a greater influence on Hungarian Renaissance intellectual historians, including myself, who ventured into suggesting that young Batthyány could be the Hungarian nobleman who helped John Dee to copy Tritemius's Stegonographia in Antwerp sometime in 1561-62. From the late 1970s, criticism of the Yates thesis, by the way, this is an intellectual network. Unfortunately, I have no time to talk about it, but somehow reconstructing John Dee's Central European years and absolutely amazing connections are emerging, and maybe on another occasion I will be able to talk in details about these people. From the 1970s, criticism of the Yates thesis increased. This is what could be called the period of disenchantment. Evans was also not free from it, and his next monograph, The Making of the Habsburg Empire, in 1979, in which he examined the various occult and Hermeticist tendencies still prevalent in Central Europe in the 17th century, displays a sober awakening. John Dee featured prominently in both of his great books, but while in 73, Dee was portrayed with a Yatesian enthusiasm as a progressive and particularly intriguing European intellectual, by 79 he became interpreted as a relic of the past, and Yates's views about his 17th century reception were also treated with open skepticism. As I have demonstrated in a recent paper, The Making of the Habsburg Monarchy, in that book Evans somewhat condescendingly suggested that John Dee's widespread popularity in Central Europe and the preserving lure of alchemy during the 17th century indicated a sign of conservative ideology of patronage and late humanism in the context of Baroque absolutism of the Habsburg Empire. In contrast, he referred to England as a more modern country, as if the founding of the Royal Society and the advancement of the scientific revolution would represent an ample counterpoint to the obscurantist cult of Dee in Eastern and Central Europe. No matter how much I admire Professor Evans's scholarship, on this point I have to disagree and feel like alluding to the recent historiographical debates about the problematics of centers and peripheries in European history. Evans was right in pointing out the importance of Hermeticism and alchemy in 17th century Central Europe, but it is not true that England would have been so much different. He mentions, for example, that Jan Baptist Hellman's alchemy was much more popular and influential in the Habsburg Empire than in Britain. To this one can rebut, even so, but what about Hellman's son, Franciscus Mercurius, whose Kabbalistical ideas stirred up British intellectual life in the Restoration period, and while he was preaching a mystical philosophy and kept close contacts with the radical Quakers, his ideas were also fertilized by rationalism. So there is a kind of ambiguity here, and this is what I would like to call intellectual liminality. And we should not forget about the fact and the findings of Charles Webster and Keith Thomas that in 17th century England, more books with occult and esoteric interests were published than ever before. I'm getting to the end of my talk, slowly. No doubt the lure of esotericism lasted much longer in the Habsburg lands, and parallel with the emergence of the Freemasons, we can observe a magical alchemical Rosicrucian renaissance in Vienna, also spilling over to Hungary. I have made a quick search on the catalogue of the Austrian Nationalbibliothek and found 153 titles printed between 1700 and 1790, dealing with various aspects of alchemy and magic, most of them obviously used by imperial readers of that century. Some were published in Vienna, that's true, but most of them came from Germany and France. Some of them are original works, but most of them are classics, from Hermes Trismegistus, reprints through Arnoldus Villanova, Paracelsus, Gerhard Dorn, even John Dee, Thomas Vaughan, and people like Johann Hollandus and the Theatrum Chemicum. Examining the intellectual atmosphere of Theresian and Josephine Vienna, one can see that the promotion of new scholarship went hand in hand with a vigorous interest in alchemy and magic, which were often turned into allegorical pop genres, such as Mozart's Zauberflöte. One could ask whether this was a superficial fashion, the last flowering of the pre-modern organic world picture, or the emergence of a new romantic counterculture. Compared with Britain, we can nevertheless see parallels. There, in Britain, from the late 17th century, intellectual liminalities exemplified by Newton and Boyle ranged to Ebenezer Sibley's grandiose synthesis of esoteria, a key to physics and the occult sciences, published in London as late as 1795. I would like to finish my survey with an admirable Hungarian, who during the 18th century career, as if modeling the European intellectual phylogenesis, started with the Corpus Hermeticum and ended up explaining Newton's physics. My hero is János Molnár, a Jesuit, whose role model was Athanasius Kircher. He studied theology and philosophy in Vienna and Graz. Between 1759 and 67, he was a professor of the Jesuit University in Nagyszombat, Trnava in today's Slovakia. After serving in various teaching posts, he ended up as the director of the academy in Buda, which soon became the first permanent university in the Hungarian capital. He retired in 1984 and devoted the rest of his life to develop his library, engaged in studying physics, until his death edited a periodical called Hungarian Bookstore. This was a kind of New York Review of Books in his time. In this digest, he reviewed and popularized important literary and scientific works from all over Europe, reading the originals in Latin, German, French, and Italian. His first major work was the 650 pages of notable ancient buildings, published in 1760. The first book on architectural history in Hungarian, in which he introduced the great mythical and existing buildings of the antiquity. Quite surprisingly, the first chapter gives a detailed outline of the Corpus Hermeticum, as authored by Hermes Trismegistus. Somebody claiming this in the 18th century, obviously it's a certain old-fashionedness, But it is less surprising when we realize that Molnar closely followed his fellow Jesuit, that maddest of polymaths and most learned of madmen, as Anthony Grafton called Kircher. At least we have in Molnar the first Hungarian who wrote in Hungarian extensively about the ancient theology. He demonstrated a remarkably widening intellectual horizon 2 decades later, when in 1777 he published his Of Nature According to the Disciples of Newton. This was the first school book of physics published in Hungarian, in which he propagated the physical and cosmological systems of the great English scientists, especially of Newton. Well, in a brief conclusion, I would like to say that the research and the modern reassessment of those cultural trends or phenomena I have been outlining could not have been the same if at all carried out, without the initial vision of Frances Yates that has been inspiring Hungarian scholarship since communist time till today, when a certain re-enchantment seems to emerge, maybe exemplified by this conference. Thank you very much.
We're about to start the second part of the morning, which consists of a lecture by Sophie Page. Sophie Page is an assistant professor in the history department of University College, London, but recently we're very grateful to her because of producing 2 wonderful books. One is the Routledge History of Magic, which came out just a couple of months ago, really. And almost simultaneously, there was this exhibition at the Ashmolean in Oxford called Spellbound, which some of you may have been lucky enough to see. It's no longer, I think that lasted to September, didn't it, last year? But there is an exhibition catalogue which really is in itself a history, a beautifully illustrated history of magic, both learned and popular magic, full of not only manuscripts and things, but also magical objects. And so today you are going to speak about Frances Yates and ritual magic. Over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Charles. I'm very grateful to Yuri and Paul for inviting me to speak at this conference among so many luminaries in Frances Yates' fields of interest. I did my PhD on magic at the Warburg with Charles, so I'm also a beneficiary of magic being wretched no longer, and have long admired Yates' bold imagination, compelling storytelling, and as Brian Copenhaver put it, the fact that her voice is both learned and demotic. What you're going to get in my paper is the perspective of a medieval historian, first on how far we should make distinctions between medieval and Renaissance magic, and what is at stake in creating a special category of Renaissance occult philosophy. And then in the second part of my paper, I will focus on medieval Renaissance approaches to the history of magic, and in particular the magical culture of antiquity. And here I'm following Yates' suggestion in the beginning of the third passage to approach the meaning and use of a Renaissance work of art through the history of magic. So, as you can see with the 2 passages here, which Wouter has already referred to, the first one, Frances Yates made strong statements about the differences between Ficino and the Picatrix in her book on Giordano Bruno. Although if you then look at the second paragraph, she followed her strong statements about dirty and inelegant magic with some very careful, nuanced qualifications. In 2000, Richard Kiefer gave a paper asking the question, did magic have a renaissance, at the Warburg colloquium Magic and the Classical Tradition. In this, he proposed, or rather stated that scholarship had already demonstrated that magic was not changed fundamentally by the corpus hermeticum, Neoplatonism, or the Kabbalah, by the printing press or new networks, or by a supposedly new subjectivity or imagination at the centre of writings on magic. Scholarship since 2006 has, when this article was published, has added further perspectives that undermine the idea of a radical innovation in Renaissance magic and point to continuities, or at least quantitative, not qualitative differences between medieval and Renaissance magic. The new research has prominently focused on medieval and Hermetic and Jewish magic, bringing to light new sources, editing and analysing them. Also theurgic or angelic magic, the vivification of images, linking, as actually was discussed in the last session, talisman making and the escapist god-making passages. And perhaps most important is recent scholarship on author magicians, medieval writers who put revealing the structure and operations of the cosmos and the capacity of certain idealised humans to use its forces at the heart of their writings on magic. Comparisons of the sort Frances Yates makes in her first paragraph tend implicitly or explicitly to view medieval magic as inferior, in different ways dirty or inelegant, as she puts it. The Picatrix, which, as we've heard from Walter, is quoted extensively in the Bruno book, is, I think, a problematic example to use as a point of comparison, because it's unusual in its combination of grand claims for the spiritual and scientific aspirations of magic, with the kind of recipes that not only Frances Yates, but also many medieval and Renaissance commentators found repellent and referred to as abominable mixtures. Here, there are so many in the Picatrix, but I thought I'd pull out one of them with pig's brain and black cat's gallbladder. Another of her perspectives on the Picatrix is that the images are weird and barbaric. So here is a talisman of the famous Picatrix, Venus with bird feet. But the fact that the Picatrix is an anomaly is important because medieval and Renaissance writers, collectors, readers, and practitioners of magic could and indeed did choose to focus on one kind of magic, whether angelic or abominable, necromantic or astral. In other words, you could choose to write about or practice this kind of magic, or you could, in the Middle Ages, perform angelic magic rituals in order to have a vision of God. So the way we talk about magic is full of value judgments. This is problematic partly because of what I would say is the fraudulent psychological or psychosomatic nature of all magic that involves a practical element. And probably we should only use magic when it involves ritual. This leads to another question. Should we elevate Ficino's Orphic hymns above the magical practice of someone like Mateuccia de Francesca, who was tried and executed for witchcraft in Todi in 1428? Her specialisation in her magical practice was advising battered women how to win back their husband's love with concoctions mainly made from the ashes of small birds like swallows mixed with water. I think it's very likely that Mateuccia's recipes had their ultimate origins in the 4th century Greek Kyranides, which was translated into Latin in the Middle Ages and circulated widely, including in medical compilations. The Kyranides has many experiments for love using the body parts, especially hearts, of birds like wagtail swallows and crows. Finally, and this is my final point about medieval and Renaissance magic, all magic texts and experiments, in my view, must at least hint at an underlying cosmology, or the promise of their efficacy will not be persuasive. So when thinking about what magic is, I suggest we need to think about its combination, including in very short and simple recipes, of a ritual with a cosmological understanding. So in this sense, using the terms technical, practical, or ritual with magic, I don't think is always helpful if it is emphasising the practical side of magic against, in opposition, or leaving out the idea that they have to be based on some sort of cosmological ideas, or their efficacy wouldn't be persuasive. That was an introduction to do some ideas about the relationship between medieval and Renaissance magic. In the rest of my paper, I'm going to compare the ways in which writers on medieval and Renaissance magic related contemporary magical practices to the classical past. First, on medieval theologians. Medieval theologians saw a continuity between the classical past and contemporary magic in the deceit of demons. Among other texts, this view was influenced by Augustine's emphatic argument that the daimones of antiquity were evil rather than neutral beings. And this, from a 15th century manuscript, is, I think, a very vivid illustration of this. But most writers on magic, thinking about the question of the relationship between contemporary practices and the past in the Middle Ages, were interested in the worship of the planets. So I'm going to give three examples: the theologian William of Auvergne, and then Michael Scott and Antonio de Montalmo, to have the views of writers on magic who are more sympathetic to magic. William of Auvergne, Bishop of Paris from 1228 to 1249, and an important theorist of magic, was familiar with ritual magic texts that assign spirits to different parts of the heavens and explained when and how to invoke them. William of Auvergne identified these spirits as demons, and he places their actions in the past as well as in the present. In the ancient past, he said that they had taken the names of the planets in order to be thought to be celestial gods and to trick men into idolatry. In the present, however, he thought that demons were trying a new tactic in light of the success of Christianity, which was to deceive magical practitioners into believing that they had descended from heaven, when in fact they had no association with the celestial realm. The association of pagan rituals and necromancy can also be found in writers more sympathetic to magic. Michael Scott was a translator of Arabic treatises in the early 13th century and an astrologer at the court of Frederick II by the late 1220s. He's arguably the first significant medieval author-magician, a fairly recent term in the historiography for medieval writers who took a scholarly rather than a practical approach to magic and provided general theories and philosophical justifications for it. Michael is positive in his writings about some kinds of magic, such as the making of astrological talismans and the conjuring of good spirits, but he expresses a distaste for necromancy, the deliberate conjuring of evil spirits that have been imprisoned by God in the physical realm. In his Liber de Signis et Imaginibus Caeli, a description of the heavens, mainly focusing on the different constellations and their myths and current significance, he describes the constellation Ara, which is illustrated here. This is a place where the pagan gods made sacrifices in the past, but it is now inhabited by powerful spirits. Michael actually doesn't refer to these spirits explicitly as demons. He uses the word spiritus and refers to them as wise and powerful. But in all, I think in 14 of the 16 manuscript copies of this text, they're represented as demons. And this is because Michael Scott says that the spirits in this constellation have a particular relationship with magical practice. They're called down by diviners, practitioners of pyromancy, and necromancers. My final example of thinking about magic in the present and the past is from another author-magician, Antonio de Montalmo, who taught astrology and medicine at the University of Bologna from 1387 to 1392. Antonio says that he wrote his treatise De Occultis et Manifestis to encourage his readers to contemplate and speculate upon the highest and most significant things in nature that are knowable to humans, so that their souls could strive for assimilation with the prime mover. But alongside the discussions of cosmology and ideas about spirits is analysis of magical techniques and who is suitable for practicing magic successfully. The highest of the knowable things for Antonio were the intelligences, a category that included a subgroup of the fallen angels. And here I do have the quote from Antonio de Montalmo and his text from the edition and translation by Nicolas Valperot and Julien Veronese. So, like William of Auvergne, Antonio thought that ancient practitioners had worshipped the intelligences as their gods, a practice that he says is reflected in the invocations and prayers recorded in astral magic texts. Antonio's new approach to magic, however, is to set out how worthy and knowledgeable practitioners can understand and manipulate the powers of the stars and spirits. In other words, he wants to give humans, and in particular practitioners of magic, agency in their relations with spirits. So to move away from worship, and much of the rest of his treatise is devoted to how we are as humans, we are all subject to astrological influences that are manipulated by the fallen intelligences, and to show how humans can themselves understand how the cosmos works and use that understanding to in their actions with spirits, to direct and control the spirits to their own goals. So other medieval writers did, of course, view magic as having a history, whether a negative one that could be traced back to Zoroaster, or a positive origin story that could be traced back to Hermes, Adam, or Solomon. But there is less impetus for reconstructing the cultural world of the classical magi than there is in the Renaissance. I also wanted to mention briefly here a couple of comments on the idea that magic, on the future as well as the past of magic. Because Frances Yates paid a lot of attention in her works to the idea of magic as a moral and reforming movement. And even if as has been said by previous speakers, even if we don't agree with the answers, she raises interesting questions. So I thought about this question in relation to the Middle Ages, and I think it could be asked about Renaissance magic too. Whether there are magic texts that have a reforming agenda for the whole of society, rather than the practitioner's soul in themselves. Obviously, this sort of attention is much more significant in the Renaissance, but in the Middle Ages, there are two texts which perhaps significantly have respectively Jewish and Platonic origins, which I think do look forward to the reform of the whole of society. These are the Jewish Liber Razielis and the Liber de Essentia Spirituum, which has a lot of Platonic influences. In both these texts, the successfully transformed magical practitioner will then act as instruments of God's will. That is, following their ascent to the level of angels. This is quite common in angelic magic, but it's usually for the benefit of your own soul, not anyone else. In these two texts, after your ascent, using magical texts, the practitioner is supposed to return to the earth with a prophetic message and gather followers to reform society. So moving on to the final part of my paper now, which is thinking in a different way about this medieval and Renaissance engagement with the classical culture of magic. Here I'm going to be a little bit speculative because this is a very new research project. What I'm doing with this research is examining historiated initials accompanying Book 30 of Pliny's Natural History. Book 30 is on magic. This encyclopedia was very popular in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. You can trace what I'm going to do it through the images, but you can trace responses to magic over a period of time. So the examples I'm going to look at come from iconographic cycles created by Italian miniaturists in a relatively coherent group of manuscripts and printed books from the period 1300 to 1500. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the iconographic relationships between the manuscripts and printed books. These have been established in two really excellent articles by Lillian Armstrong, the first of which is in the Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institute from 1983. But very briefly, the cycle originated in Bologna at the end of the 13th century, was enriched at the Visconti court, adapted in France, and taken up in manuscripts and early printed books from 15th century Venice. But there are variations in the images, as we'll see, and I don't have all of the images yet, so this is, in some ways, is a selection as well. Pliny's overarching agenda in the natural history is to show that the bounty of the natural world was what made man's achievement possible, whether this achievement was in agriculture, healing, or art. And his books on art have been mined in very interesting ways by art historians. Pliny's descriptions of the appearance, properties, and uses of natural objects appealed to medieval Christian encyclopedists because they believed that God had placed uses in all parts of his creation. And this is particularly true in terms of the Genesis idea of the uses of creation for animals, and the book on magic is embedded in the section of Pliny's books on the uses of animal parts. It's probably important to say that this is different from the abominable mixtures that Frances Yates and contemporary commentators thoroughly disliked and found abominable, because both are a kind of natural magic, but it is the mixing of ingredients, and especially for medieval thinkers, unpleasant ingredients, poisonous substances, semen, blood, but also with things like, as we've seen, the brains of the black cat or the eyes of a pig. This is the idea that every part in an animal's body has some use for humans that will, in Pliny's interpretation, help build their civilization. So Pliny's focus both on the uses of materials and on the high level of civilization that Rome derived from them made his text appealing for an idealizing reconstruction of the culture of antiquity. And it's still mined, obviously, for ideas about Roman use of objects in the natural world today. But the Plinian idea of magic is more challenging to recover or revive than classical medicine or art, because he views it as fraudulent, corrupting, and dangerous. The craft even crossed the ocean and reached the empty voids of nature, he writes, talking with dismay about the fact that it's spread widely through the world. In Pliny's famous definition of magic, he declares that the art has added religion and astrology to medicine in order to hold men's emotions in a threefold bond. Religion makes the art appear higher and holier, but also more seductive. Pliny's negative but religious take on magic meant that the first illustrators of his encyclopedia were attracted to a relatively common medieval iconographic type. The learned male magician, this is the one on the right, standing in a circle summoning demons. An innovation in the depiction of magic in this iconographic cycle, however, is to show practitioners, whether artists or physicians or magical practitioners, in the act of doing, rather than at the finished ritual moment where the demons appear. So if you compare these two images, for example, this is the classic medieval type where the magician has made his conjurations and the demon has appeared. For medieval writers, it's not a problem that magic the magical ritual is efficacious on this level because the soul of the magical practitioner has been damned by his summoning the demons. So it is a popular and widespread image. By what happens in the Pliny iconographic cycles is that we have the act of setting the ritual up, or preparing it, getting it ready, which introduces something which I think is very sympathetic to Pliny's strong position that magic is fraudulent. We don't know if the ritual will work at this stage, if it will work in the sense that the demons will actually appear, as well as in the sense that they will damn the practitioner's soul. Now, I'm going to spend more time on two images in particular that I think have very sophisticated reinterpretations of the medieval visual typology of the magician. This manuscript, a copy of Pliny, was made in the 1460s in Rome for Gregorio Lolli Piccolomini, who was appointed papal secretary in 1459, nearly 1 year after his cousin Aeneas became Pope Pius II. The image takes two fairly typical medieval representations of the practitioner, the necromancer and the charmer, the enchanter trying to charm the ass, both of which, what they share is they're trying to use words to control other beings, but they're adapted, presumably with the fact that we have a papal secretary who's the owner of the manuscript. So, to deal with the upper image first, instead of the necromancer commanding or trying to command demons, he is snatched away by them, his feet still attached to the magic circle in which he had presumably conjured them. So this underlines the fact that magic doesn't work, it doesn't work to protect. Before, I think what this image is trying to do, before the necromancer has had the opportunity to tell the demons what he wants them to do, they are snatching him away. It has for me a very interesting ambiguity, however, and I'm not sure at the moment what to do with this ambiguity. Because the magician is depicted as embodied rather than a separated soul, he can also be read as a magician who has achieved his dream of flight. And there are quite a lot of necromantic rituals which are trying to summon demons to fly in various ways, usually with a demonic force. In the foreground is an enchanter trying to charm an asp that is resisting by blocking its ear with the tip of its tail. This, again, is a typical, although less well-known, medieval representation of the magician that was widely disseminated through the popular bestiary, although there are 4 different types of asp and human images. The innovation here for me is to make the book that the enchanter is reading from explicitly necromantic. And also the fact that both of these books have images of demons in them suggests to me that we're talking very much about early modern necromancy here, because medieval necromantic books, at least those that survive, don't have images of demons in them. Early modern ones do. I'm meant to happen. Okay. I think the image of the enchanter and the asp is currently underrated as an image of the medieval magician, and I would like to propose reinterpreting, I think it's a reinterpretation, I don't think anyone suggested this before, in the sculpture of the Magus on Chartres Cathedral, as not a magician trampling a basilisk or demon, but rather a magician trying and possibly failing to charm the asp. So the tail's broken off, but I'm pretty sure we should see a tail if you compare this image here, for example, a tail blocking the asp's ear. So the image of the asp and charmer is also ambiguous because we don't know who succeeds in this battle of wills. Although, interestingly, the image on the upper right is more explicit about the magician succeeding, because I take it that we should interpret the floating asps to the right as snakes that have been successfully enchanted by the magical practitioner. There are lots of different variations of this image, but there is a text. The text is often a book, although it can be represented as a vocal charming process as well, and it is often represented as a scroll. So given the context of the manuscript ownership and the fact that it's illustrating Pliny, I'm going to suggest that here we should read this as the necromancer's failure to influence or subvert nature. Though his effort to do so places this practitioner in the company of Medea and Orpheus, whom Pliny locates in the History of Magic. Turning now to Venetian early printed books, we see two more conventional images of the necromancer. Although I think this one might also be read as preparing for the ritual rather than performing it or having successfully performed it. A classicizing historiated initial that doesn't engage with medieval or Plinian ideas of magic. And finally, I want to end with a discussion of this one. This is Pico della Mirandola's copy of the Natural History at the V&A. A recent article by Sarah Blake McCann has argued that Pico had explicit involvement in the making of the images. She's using this to make an interpretation about the scientific nature of Pico's interest, which doesn't work for this, so I'm not sure, but in any case, whoever directed the illustration has done a close reading of Pliny, because all the things in the image relate closely to Pliny. So, and my interpretation here is a little bit speculative, so I'm going to welcome other suggestions. So what I see here are three different types of magic going on. The first is Roman agricultural magic. At the top, that is an equine skull and a string of pomegranates. Pliny suggests that a mare's skull will kill caterpillars if it is set up on a stake in the garden, and that a branch of pomegranates will keep snakes away. And both of these ideas are found in other Roman writers. So for me, this is Roman agricultural magic, that is, natural objects being used to benefit human civilization, albeit in this case on a very modest scale. In the main part of the image is a depiction of contemporary ritual magic with an animal sacrifice, a magical figure, and other typical instruments. Demons are absent, so we can either interpret this as being being fitting to other examples in the iconographic cycle, which emphasize the practice of magic, not its final point. Possibly it's meant to place emphasis on natural magic in the image as a whole rather than astral or demonic magic. To the left is a figure I interpret as a depiction of Tiridates I, vassal king of Armenia, a Zoroastrian priest, and known to Roman sources, including Pliny, as a magus who introduced Nero to magic. We know that Pico did draw out examples of magicians from Pliny's History of Magic, not this one, however. I interpret this as Tiridates because of the black ram's head. While discussing Tiridates and Nero, Pliny talks about the fact that one of the ways magic is fraudulent is that it has rituals full of impossible ingredients, like a perfectly black sheep. And so Pliny says Nero wanted to learn magic, and even he couldn't make the rituals work, though he had all the resources of the Roman emperor and could find any of these supposedly impossible to find ingredients. And I think Tiridates is the kind of magus who would have appealed to Pico. He is described by Cassius Dio, among others, not only as a priest and magician, but a notable figure by reason of his youth, beauty, family, and intelligence. So to conclude, this section. Necromancy flourished in the early modern period as it had in the Middle Ages. These Italian miniatures are engaging with current magical practice, but by focusing on preparation for the ritual rather than its successful performance, I think they're engaging with Pliny's sense of doubt about its efficacy, and that this emphasis is new, or at least increasing in the Renaissance. I have flown from image to image and finally landed on this one, so I hope I will be permitted a Yatesian moment of imaginative speculation, and say that I think it may be trying to represent the past, present, and future of magic. It's the past, present, and future of magic. And that's the end of my paper.
Delighted to see a full house here, so welcome for the afternoon session. So we move on to a session on memory, and that is of course to honor Frances Yates' most successful and probably his most Warburgian book too. We've got a session of 3 women speakers, so I'm delighted to introduce all of them. And first of all, I'm happy to introduce Mary Carruthers, who is an emeritus professor of literature at NYU and also a Quondam Fellow at All Souls College, Oxford, and a visiting fellow at Hilda's College, currently Oxford too. She's a medievalist and has published widely on retrograde memory, and currently works, as I understand, on invention with a book project titled Creative Geometries, the Art of Invention in the Middle Ages. But probably her best known book is the Book of Memory, which has been published in several editions since 1990 and has been translated also in many languages. And that's the reason, her work on memory is the reason why we welcome her here today with a paper with the title The Medieval Matrix of the Art of Memory. Mary.
These art historical talks I always have trouble with, light, in other words. Okay. Well, my debt to Frances Yates' The Art of Memory is great, and I am pleased to be able to reflect upon it at some length here. Reading it paved the way for my own The Book of Memory, the title deliberately evoking her work, and thence into medieval rhetorical craft more generally. Invention, style, delivery, and my current focus, disposition or topical arrangement, considered as a kind of geometry for composing, with an emphasis on the method of placing in seats or topica the themes for a composition. One might think of it as how ars inveniendi is joined up with ars judicandi, as Cicero said they must be in his own topica, a logical work absorbed into the long millennium that we now casually, and if I may say so, much too lazily, call the Middle Ages. Although Yates herself did not pursue the foundational role of memory work in education and art, both for the 15th and 16th century scholars she discussed, and also the teaching in monastic and later grammatical and choir schools, her work certainly built upon those practices and greatly clarified their method. I first read The Art of Memory around 1970, a couple of years after it was published in the US by the University of Chicago Press. I was fascinated by it, but like many scholars, I did not know what to do with it in my own work. So in 1973, I taught it as part of a course on Spenser and medieval romance, specifically focusing on Book 2, The Faerie Queen, and the figure of Anamnesis. 10 years, and a different university post later, I was eligible for a year's sabbatical, for which my announced research topic was, quote, time and tense in Middle English romance. Time took me immediately to Augustine, thence to memory, as Augustine rightly says, and so back to Yates's book, which had encouraged me to think of memory as a craft, a trained practice, rather than only as a philosophical idea. Then, confident there must surely be dissertations, probably in German, written between 1890 and 1910, dissertations with copious citations concerning basic memory training in the medieval schools, I began searching, but I found very little. So I shelved the topic of Middle English romances and looked instead at research about elementary pre-university medieval education, the curriculum, for it was a single curriculum, of the liberal arts. And I began, as one must, with Hugues and Victor, both his invaluable Didascalicon and also his practical preface to his summary, tabularly presented, the so-called Chronicle of Scriptural History, Memoria Rerum indeed. In this preface, Hugh describes in specific detail just how to memorize the Psalms for use in debating and for other oral occasions that require a person to be fast on their feet, as we now say. First of all, one should divide a longer text into short segments. As Hugh writes in Didascalicon, the method of reading consists in dividing. Modus vivendi in dividendo constat. Then one imagines the text as though within a mental grid, addressing the compartments of the grid in a numerical order and cross-reference as required. And into each compartment, imagined as a shallow box, one places short chunks of longer text, beginning with the initial words, which serve very like the all-important cues that actors use, and then, as needed, making a series of orderly boxes under this starting point, into which one locates the short divisions one has made of the long text. How short is a short division? Well, just as many words as you personally can readily see mentally with a single glance of your own mental eye. So it varies in length, depending on how good you are. Hugh stresses the importance of having a firm mental grasp on the cueing starting point, perhaps emphasizing it by imagining it with a gold initial or an attention-grabbing image. With such a structure firmly in mind, one can then recall each particular chunk of text immediately and securely without having to start each time from the beginning, as one must in rote repetition, or, even worse, having to thumb desperately through a book trying to find the quotations that one wants. And thus freed from the strictly linear mode of rote recitation, one could find any wanted segment of the text at once, or recite long text backwards or forwards, skip around, interleave different texts, recall only odd-numbered verses or the second verse of several psalms. The opportunity for playing such student games is great. And the parlor tricks serve the wholesome need for constant practicing, stressed by every master of the method. In this way, one could make a reliable inventory of one's learning, by means of which to invent in a variety of ways, associating the items in one's memory stock in all sorts of novel and varying ways. In short, to think creatively, as we now say. The purpose of mastering a memory art is composition, not repetition. For that, one needs an inventory, or inventory, as they say in this country. An inventory networked and distributed, as psychologists now say, in ways that enable a great many various connections to be made. Indeed, for people to use their imaginations to make new thoughts from their own networked mental library. This is very far from the goal of preserving an accurate reproduction of past events. I'm always amused when people express shock at the inaccuracy and unreliability of human memories. What else did they expect? For a year, during my daily commuting to school, I practiced Hugh's method. using psalms and sonnets familiar to me, and indeed reciting backwards, skipping around, interleaving even and odd-numbered segments, and all of that sort of thing. By repeatedly doing this exercise, rather like piano exercises, I appreciated how crucial sound and gesture, rhythm and rhyme are to cueing remembered text segments, just as much as visual marking. I also realized that what I was doing was not memorizing brand new material by heart, but rather imposing a mental navigation scheme onto things I had already learned habitually many years before, in most cases, and mainly as a school child, when the memory is most plastic, as we now say. Recognizing that fact was a breakthrough for me, because the type of memory marking that is called memoria ad verbum, or verborum, in ancient and medieval memory arts, had often been misunderstood by scholars as applying to the exact memorizing of whole texts in the first place. But that is not memoria verborum. As a 14th century memory art, likely by Bishop Thomas Bradwardine, makes quite clear, one assigns vivid images as cues for single words and short phrases one has trouble recalling, or for matters that one must recall exactly, such as the theme text of a sermon, but not for reciting one's compositions wholly by heart. The danger of suddenly forgetting and losing the thread of what one is saying, and thus being shocked into silence, is far too great to memorize your compositions by rote, and that caution is given by Cicero and virtually every subsequent master. Both in composing and in delivering one's work, the paired principles of brevity, brevitas, and augmentation, dilatatio, are fundamental. A topic briefly stated is augmented through additional examples, authorities, and analogies, and then leads on to the next abbreviated theme where the process recurs. The alternation between brevis and dilatatio serving as a kind of pulse that moves the whole work along to its conclusion. In late antique rhetoric, and especially for Augustine and other patristic preachers, this compositional movement is basic, and it continues to be so in the meditational practices of monastic prayer and contemplation through the 12th century Victorines, thence to the Artes Predicandi, and actual sermons produced by later medieval friars and canons, including Ramon Llull, and as many medievalists have shown over the past 3 decades. The procedures of inventing and arranging consists in planned and coordinated movements through a composition imagined spatially. Its intended movements referred to in later Latin rhetoric as the concilium, which is the artist's pre-planning for the work, and ductus, the routes, including their delightfully inviting side paths and diversions by which the actual work moves its audience through itself. Geometry is basic to this process. The 3 basic shapes, rectangle, triangle, and circle, or rather, for reasons I will come to soon, cube, prism, and sphere, literally are, quote, the shapes of creation. They are for God's nature, and they are for human creativity as well. Since literary invention conceives of its work in terms of planning and finding its itinerary, the work's journey, and they use the words via, iter, and ductus. This is very clear in Geoffrey of Vansope's Poetria Nova, written circa 1210. The shapes of those itineraries is obviously absolutely basic. That is the thematic archetypus that Geoffrey speaks of, the topical building plan, just like an architect's scheme for a building, that composers must first sketch out in their minds before committing anything to parchment. Frances Yates certainly knew this, hence her fascination with how she studied and used architecture and diagrams to move topics and ideas about from place to place within a compositional scheme. One of her great examples was Louvre, whose drawn diagrams, she said, first introduced movement into what had been thought of as static and hierarchical. Actually, the medieval figures are neither flat nor static, but we do need to know how to read them. And I now want to show you how, from late antiquity, medieval users of diagrams and schemes understood movement and three-dimensionality within these elementary shapes for thinking logically and inventively. In Didascalicon, Hugh of St. Victor writes of geometry that it is, quote, the teaching of fixed measurements and the depiction of shapes for contemplating, through which the boundaries of each and every matter can be made clear. Or, in other words, geometry is the wellspring of our sensory experience and the originator of the things that we say, end quote. When I first came upon this statement, I was greatly puzzled, as indeed I might say virtually everybody is. What did geometry have to do with speaking and contemplation? The fine medievalist and Warburgian Michael Evans cited this statement in his pioneering article on the geometry of the mind, but then dismissed it as, quote, extraordinary, the, quote, woolly enthusiasm of someone who didn't understand Euclid. But Hugh is quoting a maxim found in both Cassiodorus and Isidore of Seville, that fontes sensuum et origo dictionem is what geometry is. But his quotation is not quite complete. Cassiodorus's complete dictum, copied fully by Isidore in the Etymologia, is, I'm giving an English translation obviously, topics are seats of arguments, sedes argumentorum, wellsprings of our sensory cognitions, and originators of the things that we say. By Hugh's time, the maxim was commonplace, and so well known that without attribution, Hugh could simply fold it incomplete into a much longer sentence. What surprised Michael Evans, and certainly surprised me when I thought about it, was where Hugh had quoted this saying. For the earlier writers had supplied the quotation only in their discussions of the trivium, and specifically to the topica, the logical method of placing arguments within a coherently shaped structure, which was taught in logic and rhetoric for analyzing and investigating materials by means of topical categories, that is, dialectic, and for finding and developing arguments during invention, that is, rhetoric. Dialectic and rhetoric throughout this long tradition are, of course, considered to be two aspects of the same rational instrument, as the very same hand offers both the closed fist of dialectic and the open hand of rhetoric, or in Aristotle's model, comprise the strophe and antistrophe basic to a Greek chorus. Now, the aspects of geometry I want to focus on are specifically inventive and generative, productive of complex new knowledge in the ways that methods and tools of any craft are required for creating new work. The problem, of course, if you're looking simply at the theory of the liberal arts, is that the trivium and the quadrivium are usually shown as having to do with one another, but the one sitting on top of the other, as though you really are moving on to something different. This was a case where, as it were, the trivium leaked into the quadrivium, and that, for most moderns, is a great puzzle. That's the one I'm trying to explore. The topical sedes argumentorum are equally termed in this particular maxim fontes, sources, and origines, also sources or fountains. And the cognitive model employed, both in antiquity and in the Middle Ages most generally, and I may say, I think, well into, 18th century, the cognitive model employed is that of growth, of embryonic conception, gestation, and birth, not a model of mechanical assembly from prefabricated parts, which is what too much modern psychology tends to use. This is an essential idea. Concepts in the Middle Ages develop from sensory data into concepts as embryos develop into babies. Indeed, only by employing this gestational model can the topic be understood as the irrigating wellsprings and originators of our fully universalized intellectual ideas about ourselves, our societies, and all of physical nature. And in this model, it is also significant in terms of physics that fontes, fountains, are always wet. For as elementary medieval physics do, moisture is necessary to create any new shapes out of one's discovered materials. Now, the harnessing of imagining to the purposes of reasoning is accomplished through remembering. This mental activity, variously called recollectio and vis rememorativa and reminiscentia, is the bridge between sense-derived cognitions and general intellectual ideas. In this generative psychology, recollection is always a remaking, a remembering, a recollection. A recollected concept is always had to be reimagined when it was reconstructed. It was never the same mental form or phantasm produced out of our initial sensory perceptions. This also is fundamental to comprehend. Because a memory is always of a matter that is no longer actually in our presence, remembering can only be an action of remaking for the present occasion, specifically by means of a search starting from what you know now, and by reasoning via a chain of remembered associations until you find what you're looking for. This was known as ratiocination, ratiocinatio, a term familiar from Roman logic and rhetoric throughout the Middle Ages. Consider ratiocinatio as an itinerary, a journey in stages from what you know now, that is, starting from some knowledge that you have in your mind right now, to discover by a planned chain of associations what you have forgotten. One word for which, of course, is oblitus, meaning literally covered over. And from the mid-13th century, this reconstructive search was also called an investigatio rememorativa, so that the logical nature of this is very clearly in place. It is the shape of these structured investigations, their formal organization, or dispositio, as it is formally named, that is crucial to their intellectual usefulness, not just their content per se. All diagrams, through the articulation of their parts, invite specific types of internal movements and relationships, and thus imply particular logical processes. The ways in which a diagram can take you from one place to another, how its topical seats are disposed, what sorts of movement are designed into it, in that lies its investigatory and inventive power, and inevitably also its limitations, which we need to keep in mind. That's why using more than one shape can be helpful. Scholars now tend to classify diagrams by their audiences, so they talk about school diagrams and preachers' diagrams and diagrams for doctors, diagrams for singers, and things like that. And also by their content, vices and virtues, the divisions of knowledge, cosmology, and so forth. But medieval classifications most commonly denominate the shape. Wheels of this and that, ladders of this or that, hands, trees, towers, cherubs, spheres, and more. The implied internal motions of these basic shapes can be linear, compartmental, genealogical, circular, spiral, diagonal. They can employ a planar geometry or a solid geometry, most frequently, or even a geometry so complex that it is best considered through mathematical topology, explaining how a figure can be both unmoved and yet constantly in motion. And of course, the Trinity image at the end of Paradiso comes specifically to mind. In procedures of thinking, each diagram shape fundamentally offers us a framework for recognition. This gives priority to how you look before what you see. It's similar to what's now called perceptual learning. via processes of pattern detection and pattern making. It is not a passive matter at all. A few years ago, I read a newspaper account of a group of DNA genome researchers whose work was resulting in very large big data stores. And they had the wisdom to bring in an artist to teach them how to expand the meager set of patterns with which they were attempting to shape and analyze their random-seeming data, teaching them to visualize using a more varied stock of possible patterns. Diagrams help train our perceptions, our abilities for seeing and making patterns, and therefore finding relationships in our world. The user's judgment, arbitrium, is involved. One's free judgment, liberum arbitrium, constituted of both reason and volition. For ratio, of course, means both plan and pattern, voluntas, desire and choice. And different patterns embody and invite differing perceptions of the same content and require us to judge not only what, but how we are seeing. And since all invention diagrams employ some movements, one must, as it were, walk about within them mentally and in the full variety of ways that the different shapes invite. When Dame Geometry introduces herself in Marcianus Capella's 5th century epic poem of the marriage of Mercury and Philology, she comments that the quality of solidness, soliditas, three-dimensionality, is what makes the basic two-dimensional figures productive. Soliditas vero efficit schemata generalia. One cannot move in only two dimensions. Think about that for a minute. Time, of course, is a dimension. In medieval physics, all change involves movement in time as well as space, but time is change measured by movement in space. So, to make a planar square productive, that is what the verb efficere means, imagine it as a cube. Conceive of a circle diagram as a sphere, or possibly as a cone. Conceive of a triangle as a prism or a pyramid. Mental manipulation, moving and changing shapes about using the mind's imagining abilities, needs the third and indeed often the fourth dimensions, and indeed Gerbert of Aurillac and other medieval geometers give very little space in their geometries to the simple figures, the schemata generalia. But, as Gerbert wrote in the late 10th century, the two-dimensional square figure he has drawn on parchment for the solid cube, or cubitus, this is what he labels it, it needs to be amplified into three dimensions. Since, he observes, the equal measurements of a six-sided cube can't be drawn clearly, and his word is aperte, on the flat plane of a page or indeed a sand table, to understand it, one needs to imagine a cube. Mente intelligi, understand it mentally. Or, if that's beyond your limited abilities, you can fashion one out of wax or wood or some such material that can readily be shaped so that you can understand it. In the Poetry Nova, Geoffrey Evanso likens composing to the craft of map making, as well as to the craft of building, and also to the craft of conjuring. There is nothing static about this model of art. It invites its audience to move energetically within a work, not to view it from a detached distance as a finished product. They seek to move us and persuade us to interact with them and not just to observe them. And I'll give you one example. I think I can find it. It's here. Sorry, let me go here first. The Tower of Wisdom was a popular diagram, sometimes presented alone, but also as part of a much-copied collection of diagrams that we now call the Speculum Theologiae. The Tower of Wisdom was designed primarily for the use of preachers needing to compose sermons. A very great many sermons for medieval preaching by the 13th century, when this diagram was first made, could be an all-day affair, as I think you know. And of course, in monasteries of the earlier Middle Ages, the colloquium and refectory meditations were also lengthy affairs. So rhetorical invention was a constant need. And as you can see, this tower came with instructions for use, and I've given you a translation of those. The phrases written into the various parts of the structure are all invention topics. So in the line of stones marked K, which is the first one up, you get amor, that is love, be single-minded, fear God, love God, praise God, give thanks to God, spurn the world, honor the saints, celebrate the feast days. And you go on from there. Oh yes, and keep your conscience always pure, of course. And altogether there are 120 seats of argument in this stonework alone, each labeled with a meditation topic or sermon topic, capable of being expanded copiously by itself or in combination with other materials. And when you add the topics that are in the columns, the windows, the ramparts, the stairs, you can appreciate how this one diagram served as a sermon-making machine, an all-in-one ars inveniendi for talkative and argumentative friars. And others could find uses for it as well in different contexts. So the tower shape is a versatile tool, not limited to a particular subject matter. And notice also that the means of climbing within a tower like this is stairs. Latin word for which, of course, is gradus or scala, which also means a ladder. So when you read in a medieval treatise that proceeds from one to another gradus, you should think of yourself as on a journey, which is following an itinerary upward or outward, or in all likelihood in both directions at the same time. And remember, of course, that stairs, like ladders, must be climbed one step at a time, starting from the bottom, that each step depends on the preceding ones. And again, the shape will guide you in how to go. So I'd like now to consider what happens when several different shapes, several geometries, are applied to exactly the same subject matter. Now I picked diagrams of the liberal arts, or as this subject was more often called, the divisiones philosophiae, the divisions of philosophy, or indeed of human knowledge, scientia, as distinct from divinely revealed knowledge. And at all times during the medieval millennium, mastery of these arts was considered essential to the proper understanding of the Bible and of theology. So I'll start with this simple diagram shape that was already common in late antiquity, examples of which are found in the earliest schoolbook manuscripts still extant. We call it a tree. I think they did too. Only it grows in the reverse of a natural tree, dividing into increasingly refined logical subdivisions. Of all medieval diagram forms, it's the most like what we think of as the outline of a composition or argument. This particular set of philosophies divisiones closely models the discussion in Hugh of St. Victor's De Dascalicon. By the time of this Bible, in 1172, it had become a standard text. And such divisional trees are extremely common in medieval school texts. The Carolingian bishop, Theodulf of Orleans, even wrote a poem, which he called a picture, describing a tree of the liberal arts, only his tree grows upward, not branching down. But a student, Theodulf says, needs to climb into its various branches from the roots in grammar in order to reach learning's many rich fruits. So here again is the printed woodcut of the arts, arranged as a school within the tower, but built up on the foundation of grammar. Wait a minute. Sorry, this is the one I wanted. This print is early 16th century, but the curriculum it models is recognizably that described by Hugh of St. Victor and so many after him. The movement through the school spirals up the stairs and around each floor, the young boy with his horn book entering the door into grammar on the ground floor that has two chambers, Donatus and Priscian, and then mounting up the big stairs to the first floor, and circling through logic, rhetoric, and arithmetic, and then up to music, geometry, astronomy, and another flight to physic, which here means natural philosophy, and is the domain of the philosopher in this diagram, that is Aristotle, together with extensive commentary, and also moral philosophy, that's what we call social science and ethics, which is presided over by Seneca. Theologia su Metaphysica is in the very top, and of course houses Peter Lombard. But these higher subjects all rest firmly upon grammar, because if that foundation were to collapse, the whole building goes along with it. And here is the liberal arts diagram that occurs in the now destroyed 12th century manuscript of the Hortus Deliciarum. Its publication, of course, a Warburg project, and it uses a completely different shape. This figure also is of the Divisiones Philosophiae, but it is a circle. Actually, it is a circular building with an arcade that is an amphitheater, as Isidore of Seville defined one, which is ad speculandum, in case you wanted to know what it was for. We are located just above it, looking down with a bird's eye perspective, or catascopus, the classical perspective of maps and of philosophical speculation. The movement this geometry implies is very different from that of a tower. There are no stairs, no ladders, nothing to climb. Instead, the diagram implies that standard medieval understanding of spherical bodies, the sphaerae, that a sphere, quote, containing all other figures within itself, consists of circles into which it is resolved. Since it contains all figures in itself, a sphere is also the cosmic body, or rather interrelating set of bodies, universal and constant, relative and in motion. In this picture, philosophy's sphere resolves into the surrounding arcade that contains each particular liberal art, and thus all human knowledge and creativity within her all-encompassing sphere. But do notice that there is no hierarchy among these arts. They are all equal, and you don't know where to begin. The cube, or cell, in monastic contemplative writing was a particularly productive three-dimensional space, and not only because it was the basic module for monastic architecture. Peter of Celle, a French Benedictine abbot of the later 12th century, a friend of John Salisbury and of the great Victorine contemplatives, extols thus the virtues of meditation in his cell. After my daily burdens, and thirsting in some measure for the silence of my cell, I draw deeply from the quiet which has now been granted me. The mind has a more extensive and expansive leisure within the 6 surfaces of a cell than it could gain on the outside by traversing the 4 parts of the world. In fact, the smaller the place, the more extended the mind. For when the body is constrained, the mind takes flight. A limit upon the body expands the mind, and if no one interrupts, my mind leaps as high and as far and as deep as it wants. End quote. But Peter's cell must be imaginary, for his monastery actually had none. Like all Benedictines of the time, the brothers used a common dormitory and refectory. But Peter has withdrawn into a quiet place in his mind, imagined in the productive solid form of a 6-sided cube. And this remained, of course, a most favored shape for meditation in the centuries to come, as it had been for centuries before. In 1570, the first translation of Euclid into English was published in London, together with an extensive mathematical preface by the Elizabethan polymath Dr. John Dee, another Warburg favorite, as we will hear, who as a young man lectured in Paris on the subject of geometry. He writes, "Geometry is the knowledge of that which is everlasting. It will lift up, therefore, O gentle sir, our mind to the verity, and by that means it will prepare thought to the philosophical love of wisdom, that we may turn or convert toward heavenly things, both mind and thought." End quote. The medieval ideas linking geometry and thinking are not new, nor were they considered arcane or occult. They are based in elementary techniques of reading, overlaying these with a method that, once mastered, makes that learning especially productive and creative. These techniques were certainly learned within an educated clerical group, but in that context they were considered absolutely ordinary. Medieval meditation is based in geometrically conceived ideas of placement and location, and required movement and change within the 3-dimensional structures that the arts of rational composition needed. These features of the medieval educational matrix in which scholars like Lull and Dee flourished, are where I think the legacy of Frances Yates can indeed be gratefully reassessed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Yeah. You can figure out how to get back to the next article.
So I'm now very delighted to introduce our second speaker, which is Lina Bolzoni. Lina is Professor of Italian Literature at the Scuola Normale in Pisa and also Global Distinguished Professor at NYU. She has worked on books on reading, preaching, and images in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and of course on memory, and that's why she's contributing to this wonderful conference. She has edited Giulio Camillo's L'Idea del Teatro, which is one of the essential 16th century treatises on memory, images, like imagines memory as a theater, and her most recent book, and she just told me, came out 2 weeks ago. It's based on Itati lectures, Berenson lectures, and it's entitled Una meravigliosa solitudine, l'arte di leggere nell'Europa moderna. And it will be translated and published in English with Harvard very soon. So welcome, Lina.
I am very happy and honored to be here, so thank you for inviting me. And I'd like to begin this talk with some personal memories. I first met with Frances Yates when she came to Pisa in 1978 to receive the Premio Galilei, an award given to foreign scholars who have made exceptional contributions in the field of Italian studies. I was full of admiration and curiosity, but I had come with shyness as well, and could not summon up the courage to ask Eugenio Garen, who was also present, to introduce me to her. I still carry the vivid memory of a mass of grey and curling hair, and a lecture that was at once learned and passionate, but never excessive and not without a touch of irony. Later, I found these same impressions mirrored in the essay which Professor Trapp dedicated to Yates in the British Academy's biographical memoirs of Fellow. I quote, "She had been, from quite early days, an effective lecturer, clear-voiced and upstanding, her hair always threatening to escape for its securing pins, or from the hat which she would sometimes wear for really formal occasions," end of quote. My second memory springs from the unique quality that characterizes the writing of Frances' book, The Art of Memory. At a certain point, during her analysis of the arguments presented by Albertus Magnus in De Bono, she notes that the author poses the question as to whether it would not be easier to remember things by means of actual facts propria, rather than resorting to complicated metaphors intended to produce the imagines agentes of the art of memory. She then comments, I quote, "We salute Albertus Magnus across the ages for having had worries about the classical art of memory, so like our own," end of quote. This candid manner of writing, which freely acknowledges the uncertainties and difficulties encountered in research, without cloaking itself in the fictitious mantle of omniscience, struck me deeply. It offered an approach to study and writing that could not have been more different from the prevailing attitude in academia, an approach we restored, we may say, a human face to research. Today this posture may strike us less forcibly and appear less unusual, but it was certainly quite remarkable as viewed from the ivory towers of Italian academia in the 70s. One of the reasons for Frances Yates' success is to be found in the quality of her writing. The things she studies please her. She studies them with passion. She wishes to communicate her pleasure to her readers. She is fascinated by the world she is discovering. And there is no doubt that her studies, especially those of the art of memory, really did open up a new world. They brought to light a treasure of experiences, but at the same time something more, mental architecture and the processes of the imagination that for a long time had been ignored and forgotten. Another aspect of our research that I have always found striking and innovative is the attention that she devoted to the figurative arts and to the notion that places and images of memory constructed in the mind could interact with the actual places and visible images created by architects and artists. It is here that we may gauge the profound originality of our research by comparing it with the work being done by her contemporaries, such as Eugenio Garen, Cesare Vasoli, and Paolo Rossi. For example, Rossi's book, Clavis Universalis, examined the art of memory in terms of its relationship with the history of philosophy, focusing on aspects such as methodology, logic, and scientific thought. It is remarkable that the books by Paolo Rossi and the others we mentioned did not add any image, any illustration. Frances Yates perceived that the images in manuscripts and printed books and the frescoes in monasteries and churches entered in a lively relationship with the practices of the art of memory, and that this fact was of central importance. In this way, the art of memory could be seen as a field of research capable of breaking down the traditional academic divisions, offering, in my view, an occasion for studying also literary text in an innovative manner. There are also components of Frances Yates' biography that have helped me to understand certain characteristics of her work, and that seem to me worth remembering today in this time of triumphant nationalistic closure. Her irregular cultural formation and the feminist passion for travel undoubtedly hurt her when she met the group of Jewish immigrants, German and cosmopolitan as they were, who would bring into being the Warburg Institute in London. Frances Yates, in a sense, was prepared to meet them. Her first contacts with the Warburg people date from 1937. In 1929, she had published her first work on John Florio, the son of an Italian who had emigrated for religious reasons. Her interest in Florio derived in the first place from his activity as a teacher of foreign languages. Frances Yates herself had taught French, although it was not a job that she liked. Through Florio's work as a translator and his relationship with Shakespeare, Yates discovered that he had known Giordano Bruno, also living in the French embassy in London. Bruno himself would later become one of the leading figures of her research. From the beginning, the perspective is most unusual. Elizabethan culture and even Shakespeare himself were seen from an external point of view, which might even seem peripheral. But what was at stake was the desire to understand the relationship between Elizabethan England and Italian culture, but also French culture. It was a choice which was both ethical and political, a choice contrary to every kind of nationalism, which she would embrace ever more self-consciously. But now I would like to approach the central theme of my talk, which is Frances Yates' research on the art of memory in the Renaissance. Yates' reputation as a scholar has been questioned. Her work has become an object of criticism, at times justified, at times excessive and lacking in generosity. The objective analysis of her findings has been intermingled with observations concerning her enthusiasm, her ingenuity, and so on. Perhaps, although this remains only a suspicion on my part, her reputation has also suffered from the fact that she was a woman and essentially extraneous to the world of academia, albeit this fact also permitted her to address a much larger forum than the limited circle of the colleagues in her field. In addition to writing books which have been translated into the most disparate of languages, Frances Yates was an active participant in the cultural debates that were conducted on both sides of the Atlantic during the latter part of the 20th century, as a collaborator with the New York Review of Books and the Time Literary Supplement. Finally, in recognition of her intellectual achievements, she was made a Dame of the British Empire in 1977. Some of the strongest criticism over the years had been aimed at Frances Yates' rediscovery of the Hermetic tradition and her interpretation of the role, which displayed not only in the philosophical and cultural, but also in the political and religious spheres in the history of early modern Europe. She has been accused of an excessive fascination with magic and the occult dimension of Renaissance culture, with peering behind those which, as Professor Trapp noted in his biographical essay, it was thought better to leave unopened. This theme, in fact, had important consequences for Frances Yates' research on the art of memory, as is demonstrated by papers from the Yates archives published in 2001 by Hilary Gatti in the Annali della Scuola Normale Superiore di Pisa. The work of the most famous 16th century master of memory, Giulio Camillo, played a seminal role and marked a veritable turning point in Yates' studies. It was Sir Ernst Gombrich who placed Camillo's Idea del Teatro into her hands for the first time, as Yates recalls in the preface to her book, and as Gombrich himself was eager to tell me in 1994 when we met in Mirandola at the conference marking the fifth centenary of the death of Giovanni Pico. Following the path indicated by Giulio Camillo, Yates encountered the Hermetic text of the 16th century for the first time. Subsequently, she discovered the influence which these had on the thinking of Giordano Bruno. This research gave fruit to her two most celebrated and controversial books, Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition and The Art of Memory, published just 2 years apart in 1964 and 1966. They were written simultaneously, almost as if they formed the two halves of a single work in the author's mind. Frances Yates' analysis of Camillo, and in particular her individuation of the Hermetic and Kabbalistic underpinnings of his memory system, certainly remains valid. Her conclusions have been confirmed and reinforced by subsequent studies of the memory master's unedited work, for example, De Trasmutazione, Interpretazione dell'Arca del Patto, and so on. At the same time, today, we are in a better position to elaborate upon the analysis and interpretations proposed by Yates. For example, we are more aware of the importance of the art of rhetoric, and from this vantage point, Camillo's theatre can be seen as an enormous machine for the construction of text a sort of a universal computer capable of reactivating our literary memory. Furthermore, it becomes clear how slight Camillo's interest was in orthodox philosophy, Hermetic and Kabbalistic texts, and the works of other philosophic and religious traditions were primarily used by him to ensure that his theatre would function properly and act as an efficient intermediary between the human mind and the vast world of words and things. On the other hand, it needs to be said that the rediscovery of the Hermetic tradition is only one aspect of Yates' work, and it is a simplification to interpret her achievement with this single key. As far as the Renaissance is concerned, it is important to remember her chapter on Ramism, as well as other themes that later researchers would develop. For example, one could point to the question of preaching, and especially of Dominican preaching methods. For throughout the 16th century, Dominicans recalled and re-elaborated Thomistic teaching. On this subject, Frances Yates dedicates important pages also to Ludovico Dolce, who was an admirer and editor of Giulio Camillo. Dolce translated into Italian the memory treatise by the Dominican Johannes Romberg, inserting into the text references to Titian and to the Divine Comedy. This provides an interesting example of how the medieval tradition was transformed in the context of the Venetian Renaissance. It's also important to remember the attention paid by Frances Yates to emblems and imprese, to the private academies, as well as to relationship between the memory theatres and the theatres being planned by architects inspired by the rediscovery of Vitruvius. Recent decades had seen a literal flowering of studies on the techniques and the culture of memory, a phenomenon that would have been difficult to imagine without the work of Frances Yates. At the same time, they serve to illustrate the difference and the distance we have come from the lines of her research. Setting aside individual nuances in the work of different scholars, it is clear that a significant change in methodology and perspective has taken place. The focus has shifted from the study of memory treatises to the reconstruction of the many and varied practices associated with memory. We are now interested in how the techniques of memory were used in schools, monasteries, and the devotional practices of the period, in the techniques of writing and reading, and in the creation of schemas, text, and images capable of influencing the masses and or of shaping the inner mental and spiritual capacity of the individual. Here, I shall only point to some examples. In the context of the numerous studies dedicated to preaching methods, I would like to emphasize those that deal with missionary activity and the way in which memory techniques were used to penetrate the wall that divides Western culture from that of other countries. Here the problem is to create a kind of language that can bring together different cultures. We may take as an example the Franciscan Diego Valadez, a missionary in Mexico, whose Rhetorica Christiana was published in 1579. And I would like also remind you of the studies dedicated to Matteo Ricci, the superior general of the China mission in the final decades of the 16th century. Another aspect of memory techniques that has been studied is their practical application in schools. For example, the use of diagrams in the manuals of rhetoric or logic. Then there are the techniques used to select the material derived from reading in order to have ready at any time what is needed in order to write or deliver a speech. More recently, an American scholar, Susanne Berger, has published a book decorated with a splendid series of images illustrating visual thinking. Her work demonstrates how, between the 16th and 17th centuries, artists and philosophers collaborated, using complicated images of gardens, palaces, and difficult navigation routes in order to facilitate the understanding of logic, physiology, and moral philosophy. Further fields of study that have stimulated interest are those of the art of collecting, and also studies of architecture. In this latter case, one begins naturally with Sebastiano Serlio, a friend of Camillo's, whose memory theatre plays an important role in the 7 books of architecture. But attention also been paid to cities and gardens. For example, in a work by a young Japanese scholar, Koi Kubakino, entitled L'architetto sapiente, or the wise architect. So another interesting line of inquiry demonstrates how memory techniques were not used solely to remember already constructed text and images, but were also useful in creating new ones. An excellent panorama of this line of research is provided by the acts of a study day held at Villa Itati in Florence in 2006 and published with the title Memory and Invention, Medieval and Renaissance Literature, Art and Music. With respect to Frances Yates' cultural geography, there has been a widening of the perspective. Many conferences and studies dedicated to the art of memory have been held in Central or Eastern Europe. This has led to the discovery of how the art was practiced in places such as Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, Bohemia, and so on. I would like, finally, to mention 2 further aspects of the influence exercised by Frances Yates' studies of the art of memory. Her influence stretches well beyond the numerous lines of research on the uses of memory techniques that have seen the light in recent years. Early discovery of the arts of memory has not only thrown new light on fundamental components of our own cultural tradition, but it has also influenced studies in anthropology. In 1996, the Museum of African Arts in New York dedicated an exhibition to the Luba people who lived in southeast of the Zaire. The exhibition was accompanied by a catalogue entitled Memory, Luba Art and the Making of History. What the Western tradition had previously ignored, but there came to light, was a material and symbolic dimension, particularly evident in that people's use of rectangular tables of wood called lukasa. In the years 70s and 80s, these artifacts began to be considered in a new light, directly influenced by the rediscovery of the art of memory by Frances Yates. It became clear that the pearls and the various height reliefs of lukasa create a diagram that can be represent a variety of things so that we have a single structure that repeats itself at various levels of reality. Those who use it can remember various things, such as the myths and epics of their origins, the migrations of their clans, the praise of heroes and kings, or moral teaching, and so on. The memory system generates words, narrates stories, constructs in various ways the memory needed by the community. Today, there are other anthropological researches that dialogue with the art of memory reconstructed by Frances Yates, for example, the research of Carlos Severi. Bruce Chatwin was already tempted to link Yates' perspective to that, I quote, labyrinth of invisible paths that extend throughout Australia, and that the Europeans call the path of dreams or the road of song, but which the Aboriginals call the footsteps of our ancestor or the path of the law, end of quote. A similar perspective remains in the later researches on the path of songs, which have more rigorously directed attention to the idea of dreams as memory in action, linked to the existence of a map of physical places that is at the same time mental and spiritual. Finally, besides the researches in anthropology, the aspect of Frances Yates' influence that I would like to emphasize is its literary dimension, all the way in which her work has fascinated writers. In Italy, one thinks at once of Leonardo Sciascia. It was precisely as an act of homage to Yates' research that he gave the title Il Teatro della Memoria, the theater of the memory, to a book dedicated to a forgetful person from Collegno, with a plot reminiscent of Pirandello. In the United States, Paul Auster, in the Book of Memory, the second part of The Invention of Solitude, recognizes the profound influence that Yates' book has exercised on his very act of writing. It has influenced the way he thinks about the link between time and space, about getting lost in Amsterdam, where the urban structure reminds him of Cosmas Rosselli's Infernal City. And Siri Usvet also refers to Frances Yates when she reflects on the mechanism that link together memory and invention, memory and imagination, in order to understand better the moment of creativity, the nature and role of the self. I have given only some examples of the influence that Frances Yates, the author of memory, has exercised in fields such as anthropology, literature, or works that mix essay writing with narrative, distant from the specific field of her research in the context of the humanities. For me, this is a sign of the vitality of her book. She knew how to address multiple interests and needs. In conclusion, it is a book that has succeeded in furthering an understanding of memory in many different readers. In that sense, hers is a creative art of memory. Thank you.
So this is a three-speaker session. And I'm very happy to introduce our third speaker, Charlotte Skeen-Catling. She is an architect, so a different kind of scholar, an architect and a writer. So let's see, this is coming up. So she's an architect whose practice is based on design, and practice of design is based on research, and I'm pretty sure we'll hear much more about that in a moment. So Charlotte has won numerous prizes, and among them is the Reba House of the Year 2015. She has written about architecture in several journals and newspapers, and she's also teaching. And among the teaching institutions she has worked with is the Royal College of Art. And she's currently here completing a research project together with the RCA and Rothschild Foundation on the Flint House, a house owned by the Rothschild Foundation, or formerly, and I think she's going to tell us more about it now.
Thank you. The last two talks were fascinating, so it's very interesting in the context of what I'm about to talk about, which is obviously not from the position of a Yates scholar. I first became aware of Frances Yates a very long time ago when I was studying the history of architecture at Birkbeck College and used the Warburg Library. I loved the post-war building, the Middle European glamour of its austerity, and the eccentric organisation around the themes of orientation word, image, and action. The happy accidental discoveries through the law of the good neighbour applied to books not stored alphabetically, but according to adjacencies of content that built bridges between disciplines and sparked new questions, perspectives, and insights. Yeats's presence permeates the place. I remember first being struck by the art of memory as a very seductive title and idea. When I read it, I was amazed by how single-handedly, and through the somewhat esoteric subject of ancient mnemotechnics, rhetoric, and Renaissance memory theatres, Yeats managed to reset the way so much of the world of painting and architecture is seen and understood. At the same time, she was revealing inhabitable models that encapsulate the entire universe. The implications were staggering in their range, scale, and scope, and it blows the mind because it is the mind. Through her work, Yeats seemed to have uncovered a distillation of architecture, a sort of alchemical formula that described not only the characteristics that might make a building memorable in itself, but also suitable as a repository for specific and unrelated memories, a place that might become a structure for abstract ideas, a model for the world. It was a very beguiling combination, particularly when longing to discover an essence of architecture that might somehow be turned by magic into the real thing. Nearly 20 years ago, when I was studying architecture, I wrote a thesis called Notating Space. And now I actually where I use this. It was essentially about architectural representation and how, the terrible thing is I've got these glasses recently and I can't really either look at you or read. It's really, I hate it. I should have printed this out bigger. Anyway, and how in the 400 years since perspective was introduced, architecture had changed, but the means of representation and describing it really hadn't. Where a plan, section, and elevation might have been a good system for describing something symmetrical on two axes, a Palladian villa, for instance, what happens when it isn't? How much does the means of representation impact thought and the architecture that results from it? So, intrigued by the slightly surreal images of choreography, a dance notation system that was invented in the 1680s in the court of Louis XIV, I explored this wider subject while focusing on la barre notation. And this is very interesting, hearing what Marion was talking about earlier. It was an early 20th century system developed by Rudolf von Laban for notating dance, where the art of memory tended to focus on the remembering of ideas, speeches and words. Laban, who trained as an architect, created a written language for describing and remembering movement through space to an exact time scale. In other words, it was a subject that fundamentally addresses architecture and memory. And while it creates a system of memory loci and takes these from 3 dimensions to 2 via stereometric compression borrowed from crystallography, Laban notation is perhaps closer to Lullism in the way that it resorts to a coded set of symbols to represent the movements it records. On the far side is how crystals are mapped, if you like. So you have a 3-dimensional form. You project from the surface of the crystal onto the, if you like, in this case, the northern hemisphere. And then you take lines from the points in the northern hemisphere down to the South Pole. And where those points cross the equatorial plane, if you like, you end up with a portrait of your crystal in 2 dimensions. So it's a fascinating sort of conversion from one dimension to another. In the top is a representation of the crystal, in the bottom is some of Laban's movement notation symbols. And this is a Levan notation score. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm not a scholar of Yates, as I've explained, but I am fascinated by her work. Today I'm going to talk very briefly about 5 architectural projects, all with a strong relationship to memory and narrative, but each very different. And this is not at all architecture as a memory system, but looking back, I think there are some themes that grew from seeds that were planted by Yates. This first project, the brief was to make a little house from an existing dairy on a large estate in Somerset. This isn't the scheme. This is a drawing by Ledoux for a scheme in Paris in the 18th century. My practical brief was to really adapt an existing building to make it habitable by putting on an extension and removing a few extraneous bits. It had been a former dairy. But in 18th century France, a little house was a name for a maison de plaisance, a garden pavilion or a suburban retreat. And in libertine fiction, there were secluded quarters for clandestine encounters. And there was something in the way that the client in Somerset wanted to retreat from the main house on the estate that suggested parallels with the alternate and more layered petite maison. And there was also the ghost of Marie Antoinette's laiterie. And these elegant retreats were also known as follies, referring to the foliage that was used to conceal them. But of course, literally, folly meant madness, and the Hôpital de Petite Maison in Paris was where all the fashionable lunatics went at the time. This seemed a more interesting route to follow. There were La Petite Maison, An Architectural Seduction, was a book that was half architectural treatise and half erotic novella by Jean-François de Bastide and Jean-François Blondel, an architectural educator in Paris. And it was a way of sort of luring your client into learning something about architecture and forming a sort of titillating experience, literary experience. And it really describes an intimate relationship between a host, a guest, and a building. But the narrative uses architecture as the sensory education of Malik, the central character, and by extension, the client. She says, you told me your house would seduce me. I wagered it would not. And this really is the sort of plot of the book. And in the original story, Malik loses the wager and succumbs to her host. In this 21st century sort of imagining of it, it's actually the house rather than its owner that succeeds. So the client is no longer the architecture personified. And there were a few clues in terms of materials. I mean, because obviously we're not dealing purely in the imaginary, we've got to actually build something that functions as an inhabitable space. On the estate there was timber that was cut and dried, using these spaces to allow air to circulate through it. And this was directly opposite the site. And somehow the raw timbers were beautiful as they were, rather than, and recall this elements of the Bastide book. So they became the generator of the logic and the aesthetic of the extension. And rather than demolishing and rebuilding, the sense of retreat was to be reinforced through camouflage. The form and the massing of the extension echoes and complements the existing structure. The house was to appear unchanged from the outside and to reveal itself on entering against expectations. As in the book, here you see the sort of stacking of timber and glass, just using the raw edges. As in the book, the house became a series of overlapping routes and circuits. Each room had at least 2 ways in or out. There were no dead ends, and the most private spaces were the largest and the most privileged. The boudoir became reinterpreted as the key space of the new building. This is the flooded rear of the structure where stacked layers of timber and glass combine both fortification and flirtation at once. The glittering jewel box or illusion, reflection and refraction, constantly changing character over the course of the day. As in memory systems, images chosen must move strongly and adhere to the soul. In the case of La Petite Maison, architecture is a central element of the narrative and mobilizes the greater part of the text. Film seemed to be the best way to record the finished building, and the film we made, La Petite Maison, an architectural seduction, tests the completed project against its original intentions, revealing and unraveling the space with reference to the original text, where Malit sinks progressively deeper into the architecture as if in a dream, before finally escaping. This, from the original text, demonstrates how the architecture becomes plot device and the inspiration for the watery boudoir of the dairy house. This is from the original book. Malit entered the next room to find yet another hazard. The room was a boudoir, a place that needs no introduction to the woman who enters, her heart and soul recognizing it at once. These were telescopes that were set into the facade of the building, which is two-way mirror, so that the first thing that you see is a kind of pair of eyes confronting you. The walls of the boudoir were covered with mirrors whose joinery was concealed by carefully sculpted leafy tree trunks. The trees, arranged to give the illusion of a quinconce, were heavy with flowers and laden with chandeliers. The light from their many candles receded into the opposite mirrors, which had been purposely veiled with the hanging gauze. So magical was this optical effect that the boudoir could have been mistaken for natural woods, lit with the help of art. The walls and ceilings were also covered with mirrors. The woodwork and the sculpture were painted in hues appropriate to the scenes they depicted. Here again, colour was applied by Dandrian, who had mixed his paints with the fragrances of violet, jasmine, and rose. All this decoration was also applied to a screen that concealed a spacious corridor where the Marquis had arranged for musicians to play. Malit could scarcely contain her delight. Her tongue was mute, but her heart could not be silenced. It cautioned her against men who orchestrate so many talents to express a sentiment that they're barely capable of themselves. So that was, and this was just, this film obviously should be seen as a moving set of images, but it's very much looking at the way, I mean, the link, if there's a link with Yates, is a serial movement through a building and the importance of a space serially unraveling, and each very, very distinct in their qualities. I mean, each very, very specifically described architecturally. This next project is very different. In July 2010, Beethoven's only opera, Fidelio, was performed as a site-specific piece in the former Gulag, Perm 36, which is on the Siberian border in Russia. Perm 36 is a World Heritage Site, and this was a collaboration between the director, the architect, me, and the artistic director of the Perm State P. Tchaikovsky Opera Ballet Theatre of Russia. It's a mouthful. And the directors of the Perm 36 Museum. The universal nature of the themes extended the piece beyond Russia and the 20th century to act as a witness to all victims of persecution and oppression. This is art at its most powerful as an agent of memory, transformation, and catharsis. The story contained within the libretto is told through Beethoven's music, and this is then laid over the history of the site itself and the millions of lives lost through the Gulag system. We inherited an extremely powerful context in place of the imaginary world of conventional theatre. This was real, not invented. And this here you see, I mean, this is sort of 2 hours drive over very rough roads from the nearest town. And there's the main residential and industrial zone separated by about 500 meters from the special section, which is where political prisoners were held. The building between them is a mental asylum which is still operating. The opera is in 2 acts, and it was Act 1 was performed in this first section where the prisoners lived and worked, and Act 2, I don't know how well or familiar you all are with the opera, but the opera is the story of a woman who disguises herself as a man in order to rescue her husband from death in a political prison. You don't see the husband until Act 2, where he's normally in a dungeon below ground on stage. A series of initial mapping exercises was used to understand and analyze the various elements of the piece. The site and its history, the musical score, the movement of characters, and the audience experience. The result was the identification of a series of loci where we effectively placed a number of images or interventions through the site. These places formed a series which was ordered in space and time by the narrative of the opera and the movement around the site, very much using the principles of the memory system. And the choice of images was such that they move strongly, but also resonate with the history of the site. Here the loci were not neutral, however, like a sort of wax tablet that Yates refers to, but highly charged and resonant in their own right. This is one of the interventions that relates to the daughter of the prison keeper, who's quite unaware of her surroundings and falls in love with Leonora dressed as a man. In some instances, these are responses to existing buildings, while in others they stand as independent structures in the landscape. A luminous orange colour coded all interventions on the site and provided a navigational strategy for the audience. And this is the sort of colour of today's prisons, from Rikers Island to Guantanamo. The key to the experience lay in embedding apparent constraints into the approach to the piece itself. The history of the site, its scale, the need to move the audience through it, and the acoustic qualities of the different spaces were all challenges. In addition, the geographic location of Perm meant that a July evening when the piece was performed has daytime light levels. And for an opera based on the themes of enlightenment, which is illustrated literally, symbolically and musically throughout, by the use of light and darkness, this was one of the most challenging aspects of all. And this is actually a mapping of the opera according to light and darkness, and we had to find metaphors for darkness on the site in place of being able to control light as you would in a conventional theatre. The issue of lighting also affects the material nature of the interventions, and what is normally disguised in theatre through dramatic lighting is completely exposed in this context. It introduces another layer of reality into the experience, and all the construction was visible under daylight conditions, which meant that the physical qualities of the set had to be completely legible. This was critical in the construction of the interventions and brought a real material presence to the piece. So, for instance, when you first see, the first aria of the husband who's normally incarcerated in a dark dungeon, "Oh God, how dark it is in here," we have him outside, but as in Guantanamo Bay, with his eyes and ears covered. So we had to come up with different devices for dealing with these elements. And this was a forest that we built in an area area that was, when we found it, covered in black coal, again representing darkness. The context of the camp is almost sacred space, and this had to be addressed in the design. The sets are devices that frame elements of the existing context and completely legible as interventions in the space. They don't try to disguise themselves as extensions of existing structures. In the historic context, the whole of the second act was performed in the special section where the audience were actually in the cells rather than the actors. The historic structures of the context which had the brooding presence of silent witnesses. So I'm just going to sort of speed through this a little bit. Another layer of memory or history, if you like. Again, we made a film when we were out there, and so many of the extras involved in the production were had their lives hugely affected by the Gulag system. And I mean, this was a man whose whole family on his father's side had been killed in the Gulag. And so there was this very interesting balance between the memory of the site and what happened there, and the overlay of the narrative of the opera itself. This was a man called Michael Mikhailovich, who was a St. Petersburg intellectual who had been sent to the Gulag and spent 8 years there as a prisoner for receiving books from the West. And the cathartic effect of these overlaid memories was extraordinary. He spent the night of the last performance sleeping at the Gulag, having said that Beethoven had, for him, cleansed the site. It was a very moving process. This is another project, the Flint House, which is in Buckinghamshire in England. And again, this is looking at another aspect of memory. It's a sort of geological memory, if you like. And there is something incredibly intriguing and very intangible about the architecture that Yates describes. It's compelling and elusive at the same time, which is something that she writes about herself. But architecture in her the memory systems that she describes plays a supporting and subsidiary role to the material it is to structure and organize for easy retrieval. However, she distills out the rules given for the selection of suitable buildings, which remain fairly constant from Simonides through to the scientific method of the 17th century. And interestingly, the architecture that can be reverse engineered out of the rules is not typically classical. As Yates notes, it reflects ancient architecture, but in an unclassical spirit, concentrating choice on irregular places and avoiding symmetrical order. The figures on a Gothic cathedral appear to be completely amoral. Their function is solely to give an emotional impetus to memory by their personal idiosyncrasy or strangeness. To summarize the 5 rules, memory places should be in quiet spots to avoid disturbance of the intense concentration needed for memorizing, not too much alike, not too many identical intercolumnar spaces, of moderate size, not too large, not too small, neither too brightly lit, for the images placed on them will glitter and dazzle, nor too obscure, or the shadows will obscure the images, with intervals between them of moderate length, about 30 feet. And on this, I mean, this I found interesting in relation to there's a sort of hinting of landscapes that become memory spaces, although again I feel that they're very elusive. I was quite intrigued here because so much of the landscape of the estate is artificial. So the main house that was built on a sort of artificial hill with elaborate gardens. There's enormous avenue of trees with an arrowhead at the tip of it, which is the family emblem, which points to the house, I mean, should you miss it. And then there's there are duck breeding grounds, there are formal gardens, and so it's an astonishing collection of artificial elements and symbols, sort of literally built within the landscape. The two tiny yellow things on the site, the larger one is the site of an archive building that was completed there relatively recently, and the small site is where we built this project. I was very intrigued by the idea of doing something artificial in the landscape. I mean, this is the lowest point of the whole estate, so that all the water drains to this point, and it created a very different sort of microcosm, its own strange sort of ecosystem. And here, I first saw the site in winter when it was wet and muddy and all the trees were leafless. The top painting is Kiefer, and the bottom is the muddy field that we inherited. And being stuck in that field, it was very difficult to know where to find clues, but there was a lot of flint. And there is... This is a geological map of Britain, and the pale green is chalk, and flint only appears in chalk, and so this is chalk abstracted out, and that's where the site is, the black dots of all the flint mines. And these are geological sections through the site, and so as a sort of counterpoint to the main building, there was a desire to do something that really was to pull something out of the landscape as a sort of geological memory, to create something that felt as though it had intrinsically always been there. Different views from the site, and you can see that there were some existing 18th century buildings that this was the first part of the site that was actually built, and trees at either end, which we used to organise the buildings on it. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but again, going back to the idea of representation in architecture and the sort of tyranny, in a way, of the classical perspective. This became used to create a sort of vanishing point in the centre of the site, which was extended in plan and section, so that the buildings raked out from those points. And there was also this sense of the buildings acting as viewing platforms, where you could have a wider view, more total view from the top of the building. And I think to look a little bit at this is how distance is created in painting through the intensity of colour. And here there's a treatment of material. Guarini in Turin, using black marble, but at its base it's polished and very rich, and as it graduates up with a compressed geometry and it's unpolished, you have a sense of infinite distance, and it's almost, when you're in the building, as if a sort of mist is hanging in that space. Early renders of the building, and I'm going to fast forward. This is using flint graduating from very coarse and raw to becoming more and more refined as it moves up the building until it meets very, very cleanly cut chalk at the top and sort of fades out into the sky. And then using rough nodules of flint to create a sort of grotto or reference to the sorts of structures that would have been found on 18th century buildings in this way, but in a very new language, obviously. And I wanted to show you some of the, you mentioned the Royal College of Art and this project that we were doing on representation, and I thought it would be interesting to bring some of the photography students in to record the building as it was being made, because these are the things that never normally get recorded in the construction of a piece of architecture. And the responses were extraordinary, and of course I barely got a single photograph of the building, but these were bits of flint that didn't make it into the building, that this student sort of piled into fragile pile. This was the head professor who wanted to know how a sheep would perceive the landscape from the building. Different stages which were all kind of photoshopped together into a sort of Frankenstein of the site, which didn't look like that. And these were photographic slides that were buried in the ground on the site. But my favourite, I think, was this, where Claire Bottomley, the student, found a Boucher painting in the main collection, and she reinterpreted a lot of these paintings, but using the people who were involved in the making of the building on site. And so this is her portrait of the flint men, the amazing men who did all the beautiful work on the building. The Boucher portrait. And this I'm including just because I think it's such a literal, I mean, it's the closest to a memory system in built form. Sorry, I'm just going to try and lost myself. It was a collaboration with an artist called Paula Crown, and she was looking at she describes her latest work as an investigation into the earliest forms of human connection, and goes on to explain, looking at the most fundamental means of human connection, tracing its roots back to the first man-made marks that contain meaning. Archaeologist Genevieve von Petzinger discovered 32 graphic symbols that show our oldest connections with each other, and that they were made through the language of art. These earliest marks have a genealogical link to symbols still in use today, including the hashtag, the asterisk, the spiral, the @ sign, the plus sign, among others. These are her words, not mine. Crown developed a series of sculptures that question what it is that has remained constant through the development of human cognition, communication, and representation. With these three-dimensional pieces, she explores how far these essential forms can be altered while still being legible, testing the point at which meaning changes and is commandeered by a single artistic vision. Yates writes that one of the preoccupations of the 17th century was the search for a universal language. And these efforts come straight out of the memory tradition with its search for signs and symbols to use as memory images. And in many cases, the authors are obviously drawing on the memory treatises. She also notes Anastasius Kircher urged the mathematizing of Lullism. So to house Paula Crown's pieces, I took the network of character combinations from Kircher's Ars Magna Sciendi, a tableau that represented for him a system of interrelated concepts. And I translated it from a diagram to an architectural drawing without alteration. And it was going to be, I mean, this was the original drawing, and this was really effectively the plan of the building, using very simple means to make it a three-dimensional structure. So it was intended for Venice, although it's now going somewhere else, it seems. And it was going to appear next to a facsimile of the cave of Kamakuaka, which is an Amazonian tribe, who whose the cave of Kamakuaka contained all the symbols that outline their origin myth. And shortly before this was properly recorded through scanning and photogrammetry, it was vandalized and all the symbols were destroyed, hacked off the wall. So it was this odd juxtaposition of two pieces that were essentially about visual symbols as means of communication. And this is the plan. And the section in elevation where you see the diagram being turned into a three-dimensional, delicate sort of cobweb of form. I'm finished. Okay. I will speed through. Do you want me to, should I stop now? Yes. So,